All right. Are we ready to start? Terrific. Well, welcome everybody. This is a beautiful facility, and we're enjoying our time in Athens as well. I'm Lynne Brown, Executive Director of the Brademas Center based at New York University, and I want to welcome you all to this year's edition, 2022, of what we call Inside American Politics. And this is a dialogue and conversation with leading practitioners and thinkers about American politics. And they're going to analyze the midterm elections just concluded, or almost just concluded, or still being concluded in the United States, and take a little peek ahead on what dynamics and trends are there that might be working their way for the 2024 election. The Brademas Center is delighted to be hosting this in Athens. As you might know, John Brademas, in whose legacy we convene, was the first American-born Greek American to serve in the United States Congress. I think we have that right. And he believed in very much what the ambassador was talking to us about outside before we came in. John believed that no matter how deep divisions could be or differences of opinion, that you could come together in civil dialogue and conversation and begin to think of a way forward. I'd like to think that's still not a Panglossian goal, but something we can achieve, and we try to develop these programs to do just that. We have both Republicans and Democrats here. They will each give their sense and perspective of what's going on in the country, and we always meet afterward for civil conversation and drinks and eating together. So that's the best way to move forward. And we will be soon convening the first panel and introducing the topic and the panelists as well. But first of all, we're just delighted and thrilled to have with us Ambassador George Tsunis, here since the 6 months, Mr. Ambassador, getting his sea legs in Greece and apparently in great high style from what the polls are showing. He's very popular in the country, which is good to hear. He is, in his words, a proud Greek American, son of immigrants to the United States, with deep roots in this country. In the U.S., he was, and in the United States, he was deeply engaged in the Greek American community and holding leadership positions in many of those societies and associations. A lawyer by training, he has put his skills, though, in the service of helping municipalities, medical centers, hospitals. He has had some of the toughest jobs, I can tell you that as a New Yorker, because many of those jobs have been in New York, which is heading the Battery Park City Authority, the convention development, transforming Javits Center into a modern, usable convention center in New York. And he also was head of one of the largest, what's called public safety net hospitals in New York, in Nassau County. And he was in that position during COVID, when Nassau Hospital saw quite an influx of people in need. And he managed to navigate all those seas and then successfully win nomination and confirmation to the ambassadorial position here. Before he assumed this position, too, he was also founder and CEO of Chartwell Hotels. He has, I said, a lawyer by training. He has a law degree from St. John's University, but the most important thing in my book is he received his bachelor's and undergraduate degree from New York University. And so Violet is in his veins as well. And in fact, he was telling me outside that his diploma degree is actually signed by John Brademas. So all comes full circle, I've noticed, especially in the Greek world. So he is here today. I claim him as our own alumnus, and I'm delighted he is stopping by to give us some of the benefit of his wisdom, both in the United States and here in Greece. So without further ado, the Honorable Mr. Ambassador.
Καλησπέρα, καλώς ορίσετε στην Αθήνα. Μια ιδιαίτερη τιμή και χαρά να σε έχω εδώ. Ακόμα μεγάλη τιμή μου, γιατί this is my alma mater. And the reason why I had to go to St. John's Law School is because I got waitlisted at NYU. It wasn't for lack of trying. You know, interestingly, my wife and I are graduates of NYU, and we were both very good students. But bringing the trajectory that NYU has been on pace since the Brademas years, I'll tell you, when he became president in 1981, it was a commuter school. It was literally 4 years away from a bankruptcy candidate. In 1977, they had to sell Muller's spaghetti, and they had to sell the University Heights campus in the Bronx just to survive. So when John Brademas became the president of NYU, 14% of the students lived on campus. It was a commuter school. And today, oh God, must have a $6 billion endowment, the 28th ranked university in the United States. And I think we're looking at an 11% acceptance rate, but truly one of the great global universities in the world. And I got to tell you, so much of that was due to John Brademas. He was the president the entirety of the years that I was at NYU, and I was just witnessing the transformation, including the establishment in 1987. He was kind enough to invite me of the Onassis Center. Let's talk about U.S.-Greek education cooperation. It has never been stronger. It's a key pillar of our people-to-people ties. I'm thrilled that my alma mater, NYU, has been a pioneer in U.S.-Greek academic partnerships, hosting a summer school in Greece for 20 years and launching the NYU in Athens Center in 2018. I had the opportunity to have dinner with Lee Bollinger, the president of Columbia University, last week, and over dinner I chided him that NYU did what he just did 4 years earlier. Last week, we were very excited to welcome Assistant Secretary Satterfield to Athens for the Faro Summit 2022. Greek-U.S. collaboration in higher education. The summit brought together a historic delegation, the biggest of its kind, 30 U.S. colleges and universities and all 24 Greek public universities, with the aim of strengthening academic partnerships, increasing student mobility, and creating more opportunities for the economic communities of both our countries. The United States is proud to be Greece's #1 partner in academic cooperation. U.S. Embassy has worked closely with the Greek government under the leadership of Minister Karameas. I jokingly say, as if I had a choice, a very determined and successful minister, to support the internationalization of Greek universities. NYU is a leader in international exchange, is the leading U.S. institution in hosting international students. I'm so proud of the work that NYU does in Greece, and it's a real pleasure for me to be part of it. Now, I have been part of a cyber summit that NYU did with the University of Piraeus. I have had NYU visiting classes at a reception of the embassy. I will do anything NYU ever asks me to.
You all hear that? And you are my witnesses.
But there's a lot of opportunities to do things with New York University in Greece because they are so active. And that's really the point that I want to make. And you know, I'm glad that these 30 universities are expanding programs, and many of them have come to Greece for the first time. But NYU has really been a trailblazer here. Speaking of trailblazers, I just want to acknowledge my friend Jennifer Poulikidis and all the work that she does for the University of California system, the largest of its kind in the United States. And she is truly a tremendous asset, both for higher education in the United States, but also for the U.S.-Greek relationship. I actually think that when there's a vacancy in the position, she might consider doing my job. I will tell you it will be a substantial upgrade. Now, we all understand that education is an investment in our children's future. The ancient Greeks spoke about planting trees, knowing that they won't be around to enjoy their shade. Now, this is about future generations. We're not only seeing immediate results in the work that came out of the forest study and the collaborations and exchange programs that are occurring between our two countries, but this partnership will pay extraordinary dividends for future generations to come. Neither my wife, Olga, or myself had an opportunity to study abroad or study in Greece when we were students, but it's my hope that my children will have this opportunity to do so. It is my hope that every single student has this opportunity, because it really will enhance their traditional college or graduate school education. I'm happy to work with all of you to create more opportunities for future generations. Now, I understand what we're here to discuss, so I want to touch upon it in a most diplomatic manner. It's great to discuss America's democratic process here in Athens, the birthplace of democracy. We are just a walking distance away from where Socrates taught, Plato taught, Aristotle, Academia, the school of Athens that was immortalized by Raphael's painting in the Vatican. It's the ancient Greeks gave the world democracy. They taught us that individuals should enjoy the same access to power and decision-making through the fundamental tool of elections. If you have an opportunity, near the Acropolis is the ancient Agora. There is a room in the ancient Agora where everyone went to vote, and your votes were tabulated by little stones. It was true representative democracy 3,000 years ago. This is why this place is so special. Democracy is a core value in the United States. We're not perfect, folks, and we should understand that. The greatest threat to our democracies is not that we are flawed. It's that people one day lose faith in our ability to heal our wounds, to rectify our inequities, or to right the wrongs as we strive to make a more perfect union, to make this world better and a more just place for all. As President Biden, a true lover of Greece, has recently said, it's a good day for democracy when American voters turn out in record numbers to voice their political opinions. It's about involvement, and we need to make sure that everyone is informed and engaged and involved, and that they exercise their democratic vote, their democratic right to vote. We're proud to share this core value with Greece and to work together to make a better world for future generation. Everyone here has a role. Now, I've concluded my remarks, but I want to thank all of you for participating in this very important work. Your presence here is an acknowledgement that we're going to have to be very vigilant about protecting our democracy. There's been a backsliding of democracy for 16 consecutive years. President Xi has said that it is an outdated model because we just can't work together. And I have news for the president of China. Communism, or some shape or form of it, autocracy, has never worked out for everybody. Democracy wins out. The rule of law wins out. People respect the sovereign territory of nations. And the work that's being done today in Ukraine is very important, and we need to be vigilant. The choice is very clear. We're going to be about a democracy or autocracy. We're going to respect the rules-based international order that has guided us now for generations, or we're going to allow the ceaseless war, invasion, and takeover of a European country. We have to work until the job is done. We have to make sure that every Ukrainian returns to a free, united Ukraine. Because it's very consequential. If we allow Mr. Putin to succeed, it is a roadmap and a sense of acquiescence. And who's next? Moldova? Does President Xi see this as a roadmap to Taiwan? So I appreciate all the work that you're doing here regarding American elections and democracy, but you are opinion makers when you go home. I know the consequences of Ukraine have been difficult. It has led to higher gas prices. It has enhanced inflation. This isn't something that is only reserved for the United States. This is a global phenomenon. And a lot of it is directly tied to the actions of Mr. Putin. We didn't want this. He's brought it to us, but we're going to have to answer him. And I will tell you, I'm an optimist. Just as I've said, the best days of Greece are before them, I think the best days of democracy are also before us, because there just is no other logical choice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and for taking time out of your schedule, and for those words. Thank you very much. A good benediction. So the first panel will convene under Betsy Fisher-Morton's able direction. We've got Jared and Jody and Doug and Michael. And the first panel will be discussing the issues that defined the 2022 midterms. What were the primary issues and trends? Just a housekeeping matter, the first panel will run till about 2 o'clock, Betsy, and then we'll take a short break, and then there'll be a second panel starting at 2:15, and I think some sustenance magically arrives somewhere between those panels to keep us all going. So with that, I'll turn it over to Betsy and to introduce the topic and her panelists. Terrific.
Thank you, Lynn, and it's delighted to be back with our NYU friends, and thank you for hosting us. Are we getting feedback on that? Maybe we can kill that mic, maybe? So we have a great panel today to discuss the midterms, what they meant, what we can learn from them, and of course what they all mean for 2024. It's never too early to start to look at that. A great panel here. Let me introduce them briefly, and then we'll get right to it. On my far left there, not ironically at all, Jared Agan. Oh. That mic might need to be shut off. Sure. Is that better? Thank you. Okay. Jared Agan is the former Deputy Chief of Staff and Director of Communications for Vice President Mike Pence and Deputy Assistant to President Trump. So thank you, Jared, for being here with us. Jody Winteroff, who is currently the Senior Vice President for Policy and Political Affairs for the Human Rights Campaign. Thank you for being here, Jody. Michael Steele, Former RNC chairman, former lieutenant governor of Maryland. He was the RNC chair from 2009 to 2011 during the 2010 midterms. And in the middle, we have Doug Thornell, who is the partner and head of SKDK Political and worked on some campaigns this cycle, which we will talk about as well. So let me start with Chairman Steele. As I mentioned, you were the chairman during the 2010 midterms, which saw Republicans take over the House and pick up 6 seats, I think, in the Senate. Very successful midterm. As you look at this midterm, and the RNC is also famous for kind of doing the post-mortem autopsies, give us your sense of what worked, what didn't work in terms of the Republicans this cycle.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, it's great to be here with everyone. Excuse the froggy throat. Pretty much most of it didn't work, largely because I think there was a miscalculation and misunderstanding of the electorate. There was a lot of noise baked in around the idea that with an increase in inflation, certainly an increase in gas prices and things like that. Certainly the economic strains coming out of COVID, President Biden's approval rating, there was just an easy call to fall into the conventional wisdom that this cycle would be like every other cycle for the party in power, that they're going to lose seats in the House and Senate, and that it will set up very nicely a 2024 run. What was not calculated, I think, was voters.
Just a minor.
Just a minor detail, because voters still had to vote. And I think a lot of the narrative around how voters were responding to externalities politically were either misunderstood, ignored, or just outright wrong. I remember having a conversation with noted Democratic pollster Simon Rosenberg, who I've really grown very fond of and really happy to have sort of worked with on some of this analysis. And I remember going on air in the summer of this year saying that my calculation, looking at everything that I saw in 2010, that would give us 63 House seats, 800 state legislative races, 11 governorships, flipping 12 states from D to R. This was not that election. There was nothing that would indicate at any point in time that there was going to be a red wave after June 30th of this year. Why? Because June 30th, that was the end of the Supreme Court term, the Dobbs decision had been made, and the country responded massively. And for any self-respecting Republican, all they needed to do was look at Kansas and the election there, the ballot question on abortion there, to know we're no longer in Kansas, right? And that, so the dynamics politically had changed. There were pathways and glideways that Democrats, if they got out of their own way, because Democrats are famous for getting in their own way politically, if they got out of their own way and made the case, then they could survive this. And lo and behold, they pretty much have. Republicans, again, looked at this through some old lenses, saw it because the metrics told them that this was going to be a red wave election. But the truth and the reality of it is voters at the beginning of the summer, when 20 million viewers tuned in to watch the January 6th committee hearings and stayed with that narrative, it was very interesting and very telling to see at the beginning of the summer where democracy was like number 7, 8, or 9 on the voters' hit parade of priorities. The weekend before the election, it was the #1 issue for voters. So the signs were there that this was not going to be the kind of election that Republicans thought it would be at the beginning of the summer. And sure enough, we're now looking at, right now, I think the number is something like 211 Republican seats, 204, unless that's been updated in the last 24 hours, 50 seats in the Senate for Democrats, likely the Georgia race, particularly if Trump announces his plans tomorrow, God help us, then that's going to further shift the political dynamics on the back end of this election cycle. And Republicans right now who are doing a lot of soul searching and a lot of breastfeeding and a lot of blame gaming really don't have to look at anyone other than themselves, because the metrics were off, but the voters weren't. And the voters were telling folks for a long time what their trend lines were going to be. And you could be on the right side of that, but they chose not to be. They wanted to push this particular red wave narrative when it just wasn't setting up to be that.
Jared, let me ask you for any rebuttal on that. Have you been doing any soul searching, and what have you found?
I should. I think I've decided to move to Florida. That's the soul searching. No, I mean, Michael's right on a lot of subjects, and I do think, you know, the topics that I think elections and the way people vote has fundamentally changed a lot the last couple of cycles, but particularly, you know, people voting a lot earlier. And so I do think that a lot of this red wave narrative and a lot of the polling that was pushed out in the final weeks and the shifting really was, you know, this kind of false hope of I do think a lot of voters had already decided.
Or spin, one of the two.
Yeah, I mean, but I mean, there's, I think, fundamentally two issues that shaped it, being Dobbs and abortion, and then the candidate quality.
Yeah.
And those things, I think there was, you know, this hope that oh, this narrative and this shift towards inflation and the economy and crime, which some people focused on and were successful with, but I think it was baked in late summer, early fall, and a lot of these candidates that were not good candidates didn't get their ads up on the air, didn't get their message out, and so when we talk about flawed candidates, and we'll dive a lot into this, but it's not just they didn't accept the election results. That is one thing that makes you a flawed candidate, but that's not the only thing. You know, people got through primaries on the Republican side because they got a single endorsement, and they did not have the infrastructure. You know, they didn't have the donor base, they didn't have the volunteers, they hadn't done media interviews. You know, they're all the things that kind of train you at what a primary is supposed to be for, to get you in a position to take on a difficult person on the other side. In the general election, that work wasn't done. And so, you know, you had a lot of candidates in governor's races and Senate races where, I mean, they were, the voters had already turned on them before they, you know, before they even got their ads up and things like that. And so, you know, the exceptions to that being, you know, a place like Florida, a place like New York, where I do think, you know, the Republicans overperformed, particularly in New York, where New York being what it is, you know, abortion wasn't necessarily on the table because it wasn't going to be. And so, you know, Lee Zeldin and the candidates for the House seats there were able to just focus on crime and inflation, and you saw success there. And you know, you look at kind of the upper Midwest or whatever, Michigan, Pennsylvania, that's the opposite. I mean, Michigan in particular, you know, abortion was the driving narrative, and you saw technically a blue wave in Michigan. So anyways, I think would have been nice to see a red wave. However, it's a lot more complicated, I think, now, and a lot more to dive into on both sides to see what worked and what didn't work.
Thanks, Jared. Jody, let me bring you in. Talk you know, we mentioned abortion, a Dobbs decision, and that being a motivating factor. What are your thoughts on that, and how did you see that play in the major campaigns this cycle?
There we go. So I think Dobbs is very important in part because for a long time, Democrats have been saying they're coming for your rights, right? So that was obviously, oh, today's here. And so I do think it was a very defining moment. And the work I do in the LGBTQ community, obviously there's also concern around keeping marriage equality, which is, you know, a right that some states have passed and went through the courts as well. And so, you know, there's nervousness. I don't think that the courts would roll that back, but would more states? Absolutely. And so therefore, you know, working to pass marriage equality would be important to do when we come back in lame duck. But, you know, I'm interested in what's being shared here. I also think that Democrats had not as hard of a path as we all felt as you look back on it. It's always easier to sit here after an election and tell folks what you think. I was a nervous wreck around this election, and I'm usually a person who can keep it pretty steady. I'm a German Midwesterner, like, you know, and so, you know, and I'm hardy because I grew up in Western Iowa, which is the very Republican part, born in Steve King's old congressional district, and then I got to get married in that same district later to a woman, which was just spectacular, but I digress. So, you know, as I think about what transpired here, I certainly think that the Dobbs decision was motivational. And one of the things we saw in this election, a couple things we saw, obviously, were all the single ladies, like the single women, like came out in force, and also youth. And so there are some stats that are coming out now, I think Wisconsin, where they were calculating almost 350% over 2018. But the other thing I want to share too, and I think it was you, Jared, who said some of this was baked in the summer, and I do think that's true. And I also think that some of the folks who probably have in the past voted for Trump and had that anger and had that frustration were also looking at this as a different election. And I do think we have to take a look at that. This was about turnout. But a few of those folks, in some races, it looks as though they made a different decision. And so I think that's going to be important for us to look at, too, as we head into the presidential cycle. But there wasn't much about this cycle that felt normal. And so, you know, Chairman, I think some of your comments about it wasn't the same. It's not the same. And what I would argue, what I've seen in the last while, is that, you know, we have 3/4 of the country supporting LGBTQ equality. So that isn't a Democratic issue. That's the general population issue, right? And so the ground has shifted. What I observed is that folks were running their primary campaigns, and they kept doing that in some of the general elections. And so being on the wrong side of abortion, being on the wrong side, as I would say, of equality, doing those anti-trans horrible ads that they were doing, that was like, what playbook are you using to win? Who's going to vote for you in the end? You have to get, you know, to your victory number. And I couldn't see how they were going to do that. So
There was a lot of campaigning against something. Right. I mean, I had teach a course on the midterms at American University and took students to Philadelphia for 5 days around the election and went to all the different rallies, and we went to a couple of Mastriano rallies, and every other word from the podium was transgender. That was it. And maybe a couple gas prices in between, right? And so that point you made there, I think, resonates. Doug, let me ask you, as you look at this and think about lessons learned, what worked effectively, you were working a lot on the Maryland governor's race with Wes Moore. Give us your thoughts.
Well, first of all, it's great to be on this panel, and great to be back in Greece. Look, Democrats ran better campaigns this cycle, plain and simple. We took this seriously. We knew that we knew our history. A lot of us who were running or part of these campaigns had been around in 2010 and 2008 and had seen and had been part of these wave elections on either side. Gary Peters, who runs the DSCC, was in the House, during 2010 and during and Sean Maloney, who ran the DCCC, did the autopsy after, after I think 2020. So there was a lot of built-in fear already on our side, and we ran as if we were 10 points down from the start of this campaign. And so what does that mean? So that means that Mark Kelly in Arizona started running his advertisements in, I think, March. We started, and it was all positive. We started doing, defining Mark as a independent, bipartisan problem solver in Arizona. Over and over again, those ads hit on those things. That same thing in Kansas, where my firm did Laura Kelly, very much getting out ahead of where Republicans and outside groups were in terms of trying to define our candidates early. And then when we knew who the opponent was, we went after them very quickly and very aggressively. And whether that was around the issue of choice, or whether that was around privatizing Social Security, or in some cases, like in Kansas, it was returning to a Sam Brownback economy. Whatever the issue was, we were relentless. And I think my partner at the firm, a few days before the election, he said to me, he was like, it would be a shame if we lost these races, because it would tell me that candidates and campaigns don't matter anymore. And so they do. Candidates matter, campaigns matter. I think to Jared's point, if you look at 2022, the Republicans made a lot of mistakes that cost them races, and it cost them making races actually more competitive than they could have been. And look, like Maryland, as our home state, Chairman Steele, it's possible that Larry Hogan could have run against Chris Van Hollen. That would have been a highly competitive race. It would have forced Democrats to spend money in a very costly market. Hogan didn't run because he probably saw some stuff that Mr. Steele saw, right? Like this may not be that great of an environment. Doug Ducey didn't run in Arizona. In New Hampshire, Sununu didn't run. And so in all of those places, what happened? The three people who ended up running were these extremists, and Dan Cox got blown out, and Maggie Hassan in New Hampshire blew her opponent out, and in Arizona it was a very complicated and hard race, but at the end of the day, Mark's going to win with a very sizable margin. And you could look at Mastriano and Oz in Pennsylvania. You can look at Herschel Walker in Georgia. They nominated bad, in my opinion, bad candidates, and their candidates didn't run good campaigns. And I would also say my last point on this is that we got, while at the outside group level, there was a ton of money going after Democrats. At the candidate level, they really did not do a good job of fundraising. There was a point in time where J.D. Vance and Blake Masters really weren't even advertising for a little while because they didn't have resources, or they were doing a very minimal amount. And so outside groups came in, but outside groups pay a lot more for their television points than candidates do. And so that means that their money is, candidates' money goes further on TV, and you can also control the message better. And so we were, in all of these competitive Senate races, I think the key thing is that we took it seriously early. We got out there early. We defined our candidates early, and we defined them early. And I think that made a huge, huge difference. And, candidates and campaigns matter. And I'm glad, because I was a little worried that maybe this cycle would say, well, no matter what kind of campaigns you run, or the candidates you run, at the end of the day, it's just going to be, you're going to get drowned by this red wave. But that didn't happen. And so, I think it's a good sign for political practitioners who do this for a living that it does actually matter. And to Michael's point and everyone else's point, voters, you still got to wait for voters to weigh in,
Jared, let me ask you, we saw Trump pointing the fingers at Melania for Oz, but when we talk about the candidate quality component, how much impact or responsibility does the former president have in that process in terms of recruiting candidates and then his endorsement of particular candidates in the primaries as well?
I mean, certainly this cycle, Trump has an outsized role, more than I would say any politician has ever had.
Yeah.
And certainly in the Republican primary, obviously. And there's a whole cottage industry around securing you Donald Trump's endorsement. And I think, and as you get close to these races and candidates, I mean, the primary strategy isn't, we're going to do this many door knocks, or I'm going to meet with this many donors. It's how do I secure that endorsement, because that is how I'm going to get through the primary. And I do think, one of the things that needs to be focused on, and I think when you look at who succeeded, like a Brian Kemp or DeSantis, Mike DeWine, it used to be, certainly in Republican circles, the business, building those relationships with business leaders, business donors, was a huge component. And so the part that I was kind of nervous about even going in was getting the feedback that it's a leading indicator when they're not raising money, these candidates. But when you hear from behind the scenes of donors who give to Trump, or business leaders who's generally weigh in on these campaigns, they're not investing. And so if you're running an election about the economy and jobs and things like that, normally what the kind of messaging is, but you don't have the local business leaders out there behind you. And so what I heard a lot, which was probably the most nervous part, is a lot of these candidates just weren't sealing the deal behind the scenes with these business leaders. And I think that as you look to future elections, I mean, that is that's something that fundamentally has to change with these candidates. It cannot just be, how do I get this one endorsement? It's more, how do I build this coalition?
Right. It's not the Chamber of Commerce election anymore.
Well, it became anti-chamber.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on a significant, important point Jared just made. It was stunning to me to watch the GOP become basically anti-business. And I was like, I don't know how that works, because this is where I come from, is bread and butter. So you're absolutely right. I mean, it's just the reason you didn't have business leaders behind those candidates, because those business leaders didn't find that connection. They weren't reached out to, and to the extent that they were, you saw play out in places like Florida with DeSantis, sort of this anti-corporate mindset, and these companies getting caught up in the world of wokeism versus non-wokeism. And anyone who knows business leaders, they're bottom line people. They're like, this is, I just want to know my taxes going up, if, et cetera. So there were a lot of dynamics that sort of played narratively into how Republican candidates responded. And you knew you were in a bad place the day that McConnell came out with his candidate quality statement. He'd had enough. He looked around and he saw these candidates. He said, there's no way in hell we're going to win with this lot. So, you're trying to make, something out of the Swiss cheese you've been given. And you're seeing all these holes in the political narrative. You're seeing the holes in the economic narrative because they're not raising money. Everybody is sort of clamoring and falling all over themselves for Trump's endorsement. Meanwhile, you've got Republican leaders who are in races like Kemp and DeWine, who've just basically walled themselves off from the crazy and ran their statewide races for governor accordingly, and did almost, if you will, sort of traditional Republican campaigning, and were successful in that. And so there are a lot of seeds, obviously, that will germinate something over the next two or three cycles for the GOP. But there are also elements of sort of the things that still work for Republicans if they, can narratively go out and talk about core values and principles, tie that to their public policy, and bring voters into the conversation. That's not what the Trump piece offered these candidates, because I look at Dan Cox in Maryland. There's a reason why Governor Hogan came out and said, "There's no way in hell I'm supporting this crackpot." Literally, that's his quote about our gubernatorial nominee. And it's when you're in that space, you're not gaining any ground, you're not winning any friends, you're not advancing the ball. And so the real challenge for the party going forward is going to be, how do we cleanse ourselves of that and return to those narratives that allow us to engage competitively with Democrats along policy lines, instead of having every Republican candidate get whipped upside the head with some Trumpism thing that Trump said or did. And if you are lucky enough, like a DeWine and others, to sort of create that separation, sort of do the Heisman that Youngkin did in Virginia, for example, you can do that. But I think after this election, that's going to be harder to do, because as we've known since, 1996, after every successive loss in races, whether it's 96 and 2008 and 2006, Republicans double down, and they say, "Oh, we weren't conservative enough. Oh, we weren't this enough. We didn't do that enough." And so it's going to be hard to sort of pull back those reins on some of this. I think you're trying to see some of the leadership do it now, but good luck with that.
Well, and I think too, when we saw in the Virginia governor's race last year, we mentioned Youngkin, when he was dealing with the Trump issue, right? It was like Trump did not come and do any events. Part of that success was managing the Trump factor and sort of keeping him at arm's distance, but not pissing him off, right? Because then you can pay a price. Doug, let me ask you about the Trump factor and the fact that maybe he's not necessarily the power broker that we thought he was.
I think within the Republican Party, he definitely is. I mean, if you look at the people that won primaries, Blake Masters, J.D. Vance, Mastriano, Dr. Oz, these are all Trump-endorsed candidates. So within the party, I mean, let's be clear, it's Trump's party right now. I mean, he's, if you get his endorsement, you're likely to win a primary. And now, in the general, it's a totally different story. And I think some of these Republicans had a hard time centering themselves. One of the things that I always tell my clients is that I want to be able to run our introductory ad or introductory launch video at the end of the campaign, at the very end. So if you're running for, I told that to Wes, I said, look, we want to be able to run this launch video that we started in the primary at the end, right? Because that tells you that you're being consistent with your message, and you're not, and you're being authentic, and you're not veering around. And so what you say in the primary is what you say in the general. There are some exceptions in terms of issues you may talk more about, but I think what you saw in the races that the Democrats ran, the ad that launched their campaign, they could run at the end. And for Republicans, they can't do that because they're trying to win a primary, and they're appealing to a more not even conservative, it's very extreme part of the party that expects you to talk about CRT all the time and talk about these issues that, quite frankly, most voters aren't really caring about. Where a person can go to the bathroom and these are things that, but in primary, and how much Joe Biden sucks, right? Like how many times can you say Joe Biden's bad, right? But when you get to the general, it's really hard to center yourself back in the middle, and I think you saw that in Arizona. I think you saw that. Look, J.D. Vance should have walked away with that campaign, and the fact that Republicans had to spend millions and millions of dollars there was a problem because it was money that they couldn't spend elsewhere. And so Pennsylvania saw the same thing. The Republicans they made themselves toxic to swing voters. And that was I think a big factor of them trying to get the Trump endorsement. They got it, and then it was great for the primary, but at the end of the day, it hurt them in the general.
Yeah, when we think about Pennsylvania as well, I mean, did the Fetterman win there? Did that show the party how to court and win, not totally, but loosen up the margins for white working class voters?
Yeah, you go and talk to them.
Yeah, what a concept, right?
We did that in Maryland with Wes.
Yeah.
And he told this story about when I was leading men in combat, I never asked them what party they were affiliated with, right? And so look, Democrats need to be more aggressive in terms of courting rural voters and voters in towns.
Mm-hmm.
I think from a policy standpoint, for what we have to say on healthcare and economic issues, I think it will resonate with them. But if they think that you hate them and despise them and look down on them,
Yeah.
you're not going to vote for them. So I think we have to have candidates like Mark Kelly and like Laura Kelly and like Wes and like Fetterman who, actually, they look at all of the voters and see value in all of them. And it's not just how do I get to 50.1.
Right.
It's, how do I build out an electorate that is, going to make it so I can not be sweating on election day because you're campaigning in red parts of the state and blue parts. And so, it's really important you go and talk to those voters. And I think you saw that more and more with a lot of our winning candidates, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania. We won a couple seats in Ohio, House seats in Michigan, and the same thing in Pennsylvania. Because because those candidates they went to those parts of the state and talked to voters.
Yeah, Jody, how important is that, especially when you think about, fractures within the Democratic Party, the more progressive wing, the influence that they have, and candidates that need to moderate and be more in the middle to win in general?
Well, I think, I just look at, there was a lot of coming together more than you sometimes realize in these campaigns because there was so much at risk. And so I think Democrats generally saw that and understood, as you said, democracy was important in terms of, being able to do any of the other things you want. If you don't have rule of law, it's very difficult to keep your rights, right? And so I think, that was an undercurrent. But I want to build on what Doug said, because the other observation I had about what was going on in states, and to be honest, I did not get to travel this year as much as I normally do, because I love to be out in the states and really get the feel for what's going on out there. But one of the observations I had was the Democrats in 2018 and in 2020 didn't run the level of field operations that they have in the past. And so, some of that was COVID, they backed off, and then 2020, it hadn't come back as fully. Now this year, I would say truthfully, the volunteers were still getting the dust and the kinks out, and they haven't done some of this for a while. And so it wasn't necessarily an easy thing to get volunteers to go out, but there was a lot of paid efforts, paid canvassing and other things happening in states to turn out that early vote. And I think that was another piece of the factor. And in truth, I kept looking at these numbers going, oh my God, the Republicans have decided they're all going to turn out on Election Day. And I was like, it scared me very much in terms of democracy and potential violence and those sorts of things. But I was like, wow, if you have bad weather in one place or you have this or this happen, that is a really risky strategy. And it did not seem as though that was what was going to happen in the end. That was a pretty big hill to overcome. I believe in the end, like in Michigan, the last figures I saw were that it was a Democratic plus 18 with early vote in Michigan. That's a lot to overcome on an election day. And so I think the combination of good candidates running hard, you sometimes have good candidates and they don't run hard. Good candidates running hard, smart campaigns, having a ground game and field operation, and folks truthfully rowing in the boat together more than I have seen at times in the past. I don't know if you agree with that, Doug, but the group seemed to come together. Many folks supported, understanding that we were just right at the margins. And so I saw a lot of unity in the states. I'm not saying that always happened in the national dialogue, but I saw a lot of unity in the states, and I think that's important.
Mr. Chairman, let me ask you about that point about early voting and what a difference that makes, and why is there still this notion within the Republican Party that you shouldn't early vote, and actually encouraging people not to? How do you square that circle?
I don't know what the hell our problem is. Oh my God. I would call up the leadership. I said, do you have any idea how we won 63 House seats in 2010? You know, our base vote are seniors who live in senior facilities and, you know, private homes where they can't necessarily get out. So getting them their ballots is a core part of our strategy because that's our vote. And, you know, Donald Trump sits out there in 2020 and basically tells everybody, well, you know, early voting and vote by mail is corrupt. It's like, dude, you just voted by mail in the primary and the general election. Why are you telling our base vote to basically show up on election day? And you know, the cynic in me speaks, you know, says that speaks to this sort of narrative to create tensions on the back end. So it's a lot easier to go in and say, look, on election night, we're winning, and then lo and behold, they found all these votes after midnight, and now we're losing. Well, that's because the Republicans in the state changed the state law, so you can't count those votes until after the election's over. So yeah, it's a problem, and it's one the party's going to have to reconcile itself with, because I think what you're going to see in Georgia is just a repeat, of what we saw in 20, and really, it's one of those things that's kind of gotten beyond. I'd be curious if Jared, if you're finding this or hearing this, it's actually gone beyond Trump and those in the party who scream that. The base now genuinely feels that these elections, you know, early voting or vote by mail is just verboten. We just don't do it. And it has been a part of the core strategy for Republicans for over 30 years, that, you know, we integrate our get out the vote strategy, our ballot access strategy, all of those things that we would do. Certainly our micro-targeting was all determined by, you know, where our base voters are located and getting the ballot to them, making it easier for them to vote, because we knew a lot of those voters otherwise would not necessarily get to the polls on election day. So to the extent that we could get the ballot in their hand a week, 10 days before they could vote, that, you know, that's one for the good guys, right? But now we're in this space where all of these things are looked upon suspiciously. People are showing up at, you know, at drop-off boxes with riot gear on, observing people who are, you know, putting their ballots in the boxes. So we've got to now internally figure out how to change that mindset, because in future cycles, we're just, I mean, if you get another election where the early ballots are D plus 18, good luck on election day.
Right. Well, Jared, let me bring you in there too. And you also know, like, might not be good when there's a whole category of candidates called election denier candidates too, right? I mean, what are your thoughts on the chairman's analysis of that?
No, I mean, it's correct in that there should not be a messaging point to hold your vote until election day. I think, and I do think, is if you look at, again, the most popular people in Republican politics are going to be the folks, you know, around Brian Kemp and DeSantis and Marco Rubio, because I think they were selling more of a message of, bank those votes. And particularly in Georgia, where there, it was obviously a lot of controversy over, suppressing the vote and people not voting, and they had record numbers. And I do think, somebody like Kemp was pushing the message of, bank your vote, don't hold the vote. And so the people who were successful were more talking about vote, don't hold your vote till election day. So I do think, I think that as we look to 2 years from now, and Republicans want to win, and so I do think that you'll see a shift in the messaging there, and I do think, as you noted on the election denier, I mean, it does look like anybody who made that kind of a central part of their campaign did not win,
right.
And so again, people want to win, and so as we look 2 years from now, I think that you'll see a messaging shift, obviously, on the Republican side.
So if Warnock wins in Georgia, it will have meant that every incumbent senator has been reelected. Is there a power of the incumbency that's there still, and how does Biden factor into that? Because as we talked about at the outset, usually the sitting president's party loses a significant amount of vote in the midterm, and Biden didn't seem to be that much of a drag on tickets. Doug, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, incumbents who run bad campaigns, lose, right? I think we had incumbents, so even if you are an incumbent, that has to translate into running good campaigns. Yeah. And so Raphael Warnock, Mark Kelly, Maggie Hassan, they all ran exceptional campaigns. Cortez Masto, she ran a great campaign, and the people who were around them were professionals who took this very seriously. So yes, there is a power of an incumbency, and I think the last 3 months of the campaign, you had an ability to talk to voters about, actually passing a law that's going to reduce the cost of prescription drugs, and so there were some real things. The law that no one, I don't think we talked enough about, although it was brought up in some of our ads, was the infrastructure bill and how important that was to a lot of states where, whether it was about, water infrastructure or highways. So there were a number of things that were done by Democrats that were really popular in these states, and it was important for those. But you had to talk about it, and you had to invest in telling, telling those stories about why these things matter to people. And I think Biden, look, in the places where I was working, our candidates were always outperforming Biden, in part because, we got out early to define who, our candidates were. And we knew that it was very important that we had to run independently of Biden and to some degree the Democratic brand. But the other thing is, the Republican brand wasn't particularly popular either. I mean, in a lot of these places where I was working, the numbers were pretty similar. In fact, Republicans in Congress had maybe even a lower favorable number than Democrats. So while it was easy to say, well, Biden's approval number was in the low 40s, so Democrats are going to lose all these seats, I think that voters in this election made a decision that, yes, we're not thrilled with Biden's performance, but we're also terrified of this Republican who is running and believe that their views on some of these issues it just makes it so hard for us to support them. And the Democrat has made a compelling case that, look, on the issues that you care about, keeping neighborhoods safe, costs, like they've passed a sort of threshold on that they talked enough about it and made it clear that they actually give a damn about this stuff, that voters decided that, unlike other elections in wave years, that we're going to look past the president here and vote for the person that we think basically shares our values.
curious based on what you just said, Doug, because my analysis comes to a slightly different point. I don't think the Democrats did a great job of telling the American people their story. Democrats spent the first 18 months of the Biden administration fighting amongst themselves over filibuster rules, and the country largely yawned. And you had these events begin to occur external to what the Democrats themselves were doing, that Afghanistan, Supreme Court, that began to drive more of a narrative than anything the Democrats were doing, because the Democrats weren't talking about the success they had. And when they had that week where it just kind of landed, the infrastructure bill, the inflation bill, it was like boom, boom, boom. Even then, it was like a little bit like pulling teeth for the public to sort of make that connection to the Democrats through policy. I don't think policies were a driver in this election. I think at the end of the day, the country settled on, and they bifurcated Biden. They sort of took how they felt about Biden and the economy out of the equation, and they said, you know what, my choice is between the election denier, right, or the non-election denier. My choice is democracy or anti-democracy, which is why it didn't surprise me to see democracy is the #1 issue the weekend before the election, particularly given, for those voters, particularly given where we started out in that. So I don't know if this was so much a policy-driven narrative so much. I mean, I get it. You want to pat yourselves on the back about the good things that you were able to get done under difficult circumstances. I'm not begrudging that. But I don't know if that, at the end of the day, people were sitting there going, I really, really love this infrastructure bill. And that's going to carry my vote right through this Tuesday.
No, okay, so just to be clear, I'm not saying that this was based off policy. What I'm saying and what I said was that at the end of the day, the voters chose to support people that they believe shared their values. And ultimately, I think in a lot of these places, these were about these candidates' character. But this larger narrative, that the media narrative, I believe is wrong in terms of, well, Democrats didn't talk about the economy or didn't talk about crime. Most people get their news from local news. And I can tell you, having produced 600 ads this cycle, that we made ads talking about prescription drugs. We made ads talking about costs. We made ads talking about crime. So at a macro level, I do agree with you. I think there were, throughout these last 2 years, it was a lot of sausage making around Build Back Better and all this other stuff. But in these states where these candidates were running super professional campaigns and communicating early, they were talking about those issues. So I think that you almost have to separate what was going on at the national level and what Democrats were doing at the national level than what they were doing at the state and district level, where they were able to convince voters, enough voters, that, look, we get it, right? And here are some of the things that we're doing. But look, this person over here has some very extreme and dangerous ideas, and they're just and that disqualified them. It made us, we were able to pass a threshold on the things that voters cared about. And so it ultimately became a question of character and values. And I think, and I think on those, and that's where I think Democrats won. But I do think we were talking about some of these issues in a way that maybe weren't seen at a national level, but at a local level, they certainly were being brought up and discussed. I mean, Tim Ryan, who lost, but he was talking a lot about manufacturing and jobs in China, and so yeah, that's what I think it was an interesting sort of national conversation versus what was going on at the local level.
Yeah, Joe, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I just want to weigh in on that too. I do think that the national narrative versus what was going on in a lot of states and these congressional districts was different. And that's also where the level of campaign that was being run became part of the challenge, right? So you brought it up, Betsy, around, you saw it in Pennsylvania. What was Mastriano's plan? what was he for, right? And you didn't hear so much of what he was for. And so the Democrats were able to push some of these folks out on the limb, if you will, and start to saw it off because they just wouldn't come in towards the core and think about that. I also think there's still a Trump effect, I believe, with many of the voters in the middle. And they got so tired of watching what was happening nationally or worried what was being posted on Twitter that they still have PTSD from that. And I think they're not happy necessarily with Biden. It's still a place to put some of their anger and frustration. But I also think that made them just look at what's going on around here. This is all I can handle. I can't worry about that national stuff. My God, I don't know if we're ever going to get that right, but I can be a part of what can happen here. And I think that's what I also saw in some of the research we were doing and tracking. And then the last thing, and this is, part of some of the issues we worked on the transgender issues, our community, the LGBTQ community, has had a history of some portion of our community being under attack a lot. It's not a new phenomenon. Our marriages were under attack. We as individuals in the 80s were under attack. This has been a narrative that we have dealt with for a long time. What we see is when more folks know us as individuals, the less likely it is that they're against us. But then there's also a piece of this that we don't really talk about. How many of those Republicans actually had ever met somebody who was transgender? Right? So if you're trying to prioritize an issue like that and you're trying to make it an issue, well, how does that become more of an issue in a general election versus inflation or, their job or whatever else it might be? Like, it's only a narrow group of folks. And right now we calculate that to be, we call it ultra MAGA. We think it's around 15 to 17%. Well, if you're only communicating with that group of people and you need to turn those people out at the end of your election in some of these races, what the heck were you doing all summer and into the fall? I mean, if that's the campaign you're running at the end, holy Toledo, you were really asleep at the wheel. And so, that it's a selfish perspective to some degree in terms of, but we really saw that. And I think, also I do want to say, look, these messages are harmful to kids, and it's particularly focused on kids, which I think is atrocious. They do damage to folks, and I certainly hope we can see a day where that's not the kind of messaging we're going to see coming out of a particular party or a set of candidates. But I think they're totally missing the boat on it, and it's going to come back to bite them in the behind, because in the next 10 years, oh, that's okay, I'll finish this quickly. Right now, LGBTQ people are 8% of the voting that happened in this last election, more than people kind of realize. But if you look ahead to 2030 or 2040, we're going to be 14% in 2030. We're going to be 18% in 2040. That's a voting bloc that is growing, and we have family and friends, and part of how we calculate and capture this is we talk about equality voters and we message to equality voters, and there are 62 million equality voters in this country. There are a couple million equality voters in Arizona, and so we can message to those folks who are either LGBTQ or our allies. That's how we get to those 3/4 of the people who support our legal equality. Those are going to grow, and youth, 1 in 4 or 1 in 5, depending upon which study you look at. So, at some point, I don't know where some of these Republican candidates are going to get their votes. I don't know where they come from.
And young people, they actually voted this cycle. Sometimes we would talk about the youth vote and they don't actually show up, and it appears that they did. Jared, I'm going to be remiss if I don't ask you about your former boss here, because he's out on a book tour. Made some comments on ABC about Trump's actions being, quote, reckless over January 6th, and Trump decided to be, quote, part of the problem. Give us your thoughts.
Breaking news.
Yeah.
No, it's I worked very closely with Mike Pence, and behind the scenes, in front of the president, I mean, he was as loyal as can be. I mean, never, even if I showed him a tweet or something and said, "Was this really the best thing?" and never took the bait, never ever said anything against the president the entire time I knew him. And so
That's amazing.
To see what happened on January 6th, I do think there was a lot of people who were Trump fans and had watched that relationship too. I mean, obviously it was very close to it, and to see that for all the loyalty, that he put in, that it was not reciprocated, obviously. And so I'm not surprised to see his comments, and obviously he's taken some time. He's, Mike Pence is, whatever you say about him, he's very thoughtful, and he's taken the time to kind of unpack all of his thoughts, and I think he's going to be a lot more vocal now, obviously, and so I think that's a good thing. And but yeah, I mean, he was there with his family. I mean, I was getting texts from, these are Secret Service agents around him, and staffers who I worked closely with, and then to see that they felt like their lives were in danger, and I mean, those are the kinds of things that it impacts everybody differently, but when I saw things like that, I mean, you just really feel for them. So, anyways, I mean that we'll see. I have to read the book. I haven't read it yet.
Well, what do you see as the future for Pence politically? Do you think he'll run for president? What lane is he going to be in? What's your?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be. I think there will be people willing to challenge President Trump. I mean, yeah. President Trump is odds on and the huge favorite right now. I do think the results of last Tuesday is going to encourage people like Pence, people like DeSantis to get in. It's the primaries it's a marathon, and so I do think in the Republican Party you are going to have to beat Trump, and that is a lot easier to say, and when you actually get on the stage or go at, it is not easy, and so any of the talk now about it's DeSantis versus Trump, I mean, it's not really just going to be DeSantis versus Trump. It's probably not going to be a one-on-one. It's going to be several people involved, and everyone saw how formidable President Trump was in 2016 of mowing down these 17 other people. So, I do think, I think that people will have to have very targeted ways of going at him state by state, and,
right.
and someone like DeSantis and Pence and these other they President Trump's run twice now national campaigns, and they need to build national organizations, and DeSantis had this incredible victory and something we haven't touched on, and so I'll just cheerlead here a little bit of like the inroads with the Latino community and the wins in Miami-Dade and just across the board of non-traditional Republican voters. Mm-hmm. I mean, that is a huge thing that DeSantis did. Now, you have to build a national campaign to do that around the country, and it remains to be seen, who can do that. And President he's done it twice now, and that counts for something.
Yeah, well, but in many ways, the large field in 2016 helped Trump emerge, right? I mean, the more people that run against him, the better chances he actually has of winning a primary. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it splits the non-Trump vote.
Exactly. So. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. But here's the end of the day for me. The thing about Trump, having worked with him before politics for him, and observing him in politics, if you're not prepared to confront him as the bully he is politically, then don't even get in the race. Don't pretend. I'm a very strong Mike Pence supporter and admirer, but if the vice president's going to get in the race, he's got to get in the race. He's got to be prepared to stand up and say, you know what, you just need to shut the hell up because you're wrong. And if you're not prepared to do that with Trump, then you're not going to, you go back and look at the, just go back and if you want to, just for your amusement and enjoyment, watch those debates with those Republicans and watch them each fall.
Yeah.
Because they didn't stand up to, if I'm standing on the stage and you say my wife is ugly, oh baby, we're going to have a conversation. We're going to have a conversation. And it's not going to be one you're going to like. And so unless you're prepared to do that, and I'm not convinced anyone is, which is his superpower, because everyone says, oh, okay, how do I do this? Well, just get up in his face. If you're not prepared to stand up in his face, then this is not going to go easily for you. You know, a Liz Cheney in that primary, whole different conversation. A Larry Hogan in that primary, a whole different conversation. But the establishment guys, the Marco Rubios, right? With all respect, the Mike Pences, if you haven't shown that quality now, up to now, I don't know when you get to show it, where you're going to just draw that line and go, no, I'm sorry, this is, no, we're not doing the election was, 2020 election was stolen, we're not doing any of that. And so that to me is what I'm looking for. Who in the lot, because I'm not convinced DeSantis at the end of the day is necessarily prepared to do that now, willing to be proven wrong. Same with Mike Pence, willing to be proven wrong. But I just haven't seen anyone up to this point draw that bright line and say, no, we're not doing this anymore. And until someone is, and I think you got to do it before you get on that stage in that first debate, it's going to be interesting to see whether or not this actually plays out. This is going to be just a glide path for Trump.
I don't want to steal any thunder from the 2024 panel. So midterms are not over. We've got the race in Georgia. So, and we want to take a couple questions from the audience too. But before we do that, let me just go down and get your analysis on where things, how things look right now in Georgia. Doug, you want to start?
I mean, look, I feel pretty good about the runoff. Warnock has a very good campaign, and you know, I do think without the Senate being, you know, at stake, I think that will have an impact on turnout. Now, which side benefits from that is another question, but I do think that, you know, look, Warnock went through this. He's been through this before. He's got a very, very good operation. What I'm hearing about Walker's campaign is essentially he's having to rent Brian Kemp's operation because he really doesn't have one, and at least not one that's professional. And that's a problem. You know, I mean, those folks worked hard for Brian Kemp. They didn't work hard. You know, it's hard to just sort of, you know, pass that down to someone. You know, I mean, so I feel pretty good about Democrats' chances in Georgia and Warnock and winning that.
Jerry?
Well, I do. I think the smartest things Herschel Walker can do is hold Brian Kemp and DeSantis tight. I mean, those are, you got two very popular governors, both kind of in the media markets that Herschel Walker needs to hit, and you know, lean on them as much as you can, and that's his path to victory. So my hope is you see a lot of DeSantis and Brian Kemp, you know, campaigning with him.
I think that Reverend Warnock has run a really good campaign, and I think he's become an even better candidate. You know, when he first ran, I think he needed to get his rhythm and find his sea legs, but, you know, he had to turn around and run right away again. And so he's already been through this will be his fourth election, right? So he had 2 elections because he had a runoff before. So he has a lot of that experience under his belt, and I got to see him out there on the trail, and he's in his stride. And so I think he's in his stride, his team is in their stride. I do not see the same thing around Herschel Walker, and I didn't know that he was gonna grab Kemp's field team. I do think he did ride on Kemp's coattails to some degree in this election to get to the runoff. And the last numbers I saw there, it was like 0.6% away from being not a runoff. Yeah. And so, I think we're going to see Reverend Warnock win, but it's going to be a vote turnout that the Democrats have to do all over again. But I think folks are pretty fired up to do that.
Chairman?
Yeah, I agree with Jared on this one. When it comes to Georgia, the only thing that Herschel Walker can do is rely on the two most popular Republican governors in his region, his own governor, Kemp, and Ron DeSantis. I agree with you, Jody. The idea of sort of taking the infrastructure of another campaign and trying to apply it, I think becomes very, very difficult to do. There's a reason you saw the breakdown in the vote. People voted for Kemp. They did not vote for Walker. I do not know how you turn that part around. And I don't think getting the infrastructure is going to necessarily get you there. So Walker's going to have some work to do. I think advantage Warnock right now. To the extent that you have any additional narratives around, don't early vote, don't vote by mail from Republicans, that's only going to make it more difficult for Herschel Walker in the end to win this. But at this point, you're just playing for status quo ante, right? Because the Democrats are going to control the Senate. So it really, in one sense, which will be interesting to see what that enthusiasm level is.
Right. Biden's pitch right now is more is better.
Yeah. Well, I think the advantage goes to Biden in making the pitch, because it's better to have 51, and that way you sort of, at least you got a neutral on.
A mansion cushion.
Right, you got a mansion cushion. But for Republicans, I don't know. We want the seat, so what?
Yeah.
Well, and Walker's in a really interesting position because he is Trump's guy, right? Trump handpicked him to run, but now he's embracing, or he's bringing in Kemp, who Trump hates. He's and DeSantis, who used to be a super Trumper and now is trying to not be. But so how does that, that's going to be an interesting 3 weeks where Walker is going to be, does Trump demand to go campaign there, or does he start, does he create a level of tension within Walker's operation because, look, he wouldn't have run unless Trump said you should run.
Well, if Trump seriously announces, but he told us he was very, very, very probably going to do it, so we don't know. We don't know. But if he does, then as an announced candidate for the presidency with this runoff election coming up, Trump is going to want to be on the ground in Georgia at some point, which again does not help Walker's cause. So I think the Hill is a big one. My interest in watching this is going to be exactly in terms of how enthusiastic they are going to be, because it's not like this is going to give us control of the Senate.
Right.
It's a very different kind of vibe if it's just for status quo ante.
Yeah. All right, let's take any questions from the group. We have about 5 minutes. Anyone have a question? Who are shy today?
They're shy.
There you go.
Well, I'll start with a question.
Thank you.
Does this work?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. This maybe isn't the right question for the panel specifically, but more getting into the lame duck as now that we have a likely split. Any ideas of how the whole debt limit debate's going to play out? Does McCarthy and McConnell have to bow to some of the more hardliners? Do you think they get a deal on this related to the debt limit? I don't know who follows that the most.
I have an opinion about this. I think that McConnell, well, McCarthy probably more than McConnell, he doesn't want to carry this into the spring, right, and have to deal with this in February, March, April, somewhere in there. he doesn't want to have to worry about it. I think they'll cut a deal and get it done before they leave for Christmas.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think if McConnell was going to be the majority leader, maybe some of the, there may be a recalculation in terms of, how much they want to allow Democrats to get done during the lame duck. But I think, look, they've got to fund the government and they've got to do debt ceiling. There's probably some tax extenders that they've got to get done. And my sense is that, given that it will likely be, it will definitely be a Senate controlled by Democrats and a House that will likely be controlled by Republicans, it's maybe just better to just get it all done in the next month or two and move on.
Yeah, I'd agree with that too. I think the goal is to try to clear that off the tables as much as possible, particularly given if the Republican House is a narrower majority than the one that they anticipated. There's going to be a lot of internal pressures to do all kinds of things that they told us they wanted to do, and investigating Joe Biden and doing all these other things. And so the goal is, particularly I think McConnell, I think you're right, is going to drive that more than anything else. Just get it done. We can take this off the plate because we don't want that to get caught up in all the stuff on the back end that could come down the pike a little bit afterwards.
Trump will weigh in too, though, on that and make it extremely difficult for those folks.
Yeah, but if they ignore them, they'll be okay.
Question?
I got a question for anyone and everyone on the panel about our home state of New York. Because surely the only way to paint is what happened is a disaster for Democrats in that state, statewide. You can write off some of that due to the redistricting disaster that ended up happening. But, I wonder if there are any lessons to be learned for Democrats and any opportunities to be realized for Republicans coming out of this big blue state where Democrats did so poorly.
Can I just put my chairman hat on? As New York was always one of those states that I would talk to party officials there. People forget New Yorkers elect Republicans, all right? New Yorkers, are like every other voter out there. You make the case, you can get what you need from them in terms of the vote, and I think that was the case here. I think that on a number of levels and a number of fronts, Republicans made a better argument. You can chalk it off to redistricting. I love how people sort of complain about redistricting today when, one party controlled the House of Representatives for 40 years and no one complained. For 40 years, the Democrats controlled the House of Representatives. And so now in each of these cycles, every 10 years you hear all this moaning and groaning about redistricting. Okay, there's some real issues with redistricting that can be dealt with. But I think at the end of the day, you still have to make the case as a party and as candidates, which is important. And I think they did a very effective job of doing that and was able to position the messaging in a way that a lot of New Yorkers are like, okay, and yeah, 4 House seats, and the governorship was, a nail biter for a while there. So the takeaway lesson is you can't slackjaw it. You've gotta stay engaged in the conversation and listen to what the voters are telling you, and not presume, well, we're a Democratic state. Well, no, you're not really. Because you've elected Republican governors and you've elected Republican officials. The Senate at least, has gone back and forth between Republicans and Democrats. It's not like Maryland, where Ehrlich and Hogan were kind of outliers, but Hogan kind of stabilized the narrative there in Maryland. Now Republicans, up until this cycle, could relatively be a little bit more competitive. So I think there's some really good opportunities for Republicans going forward, particularly when you look at the kind of candidates they can put forward in some of these districts and statewide. And the lesson for Democrats, just because you think it's blue doesn't mean it is.
Yeah, I mean, look, Governor Hochul, won with 54%. I don't know what the final numbers are, but 54%. She did not do particularly well in Long Island districts and suburbs, sort of the suburbs around New York City. and that really hurt, and that's where we lost those seats. And that was really sort of, I don't think it had really anything to do with redistricting. I think, the chairman's right. I think in part it had, I think it's just that, if she had run at 60%, we would have won those places. But I will say the candidates who ran there, Sean Patrick Maloney ran a really good campaign. He was facing a barrage of outside money spending against him. He waved off allied groups so that they didn't have to spend for him. And in some ways he was sort of, he took I think the speaker said it, an arrow for the party. But he ran a really good campaign, and several of the other Democrats, they all took it seriously. But when you have quite frankly, I think just that, Governor Hochul was not as strong as she needed to be at the top of the ticket. And even Schumer's numbers weren't historically Schumer's numbers, right? So, and I think there was definitely something around this issue of cash bail that was featured in almost every negative ad against Democrats, whether or not they were part of the assembly or not. That was front and center in all of these, these campaigns, and crime was an important issue. And even though Democrats talked about it, it was something that, I think, for Republicans, they were able to really make this case that full party rule in Albany was resulting in some of these things that made us less safe. And I think that was, whether that's true or not, I think it was a message that they just were pounding away at in these districts. And it ultimately they lost by very thin margins. But I do think if the governor had been a little bit stronger in some of those places, probably would have pulled it out.
Yeah, Doug made the point earlier, but it's campaigns and candidates matter, and I think that, we've been talking a lot about where it hurt Republicans. I think this is the exact point where it helped, and it was a focused campaign, it seemed like, across the board of targeting on crime and not getting into some of these other issues that we've been real critical of today. And it was, it kept it on an issue that voters ultimately did care about. I do think that, as I mentioned earlier, Dobbs probably didn't have as big of an effect as you probably saw in places like Michigan and some of these other, Pennsylvania. And so, Lee Zeldin seemed like he was very focused, and even though he came up short, was able to, he did have coattails enough in these areas, and everybody was on, the right message points. So.
All right, well, appropriately, we're going to leave it and end on New York, since this is NYU after all. More to come, though. Our next panel, panel 2, is going to be polling and media coverage of the 2022 midterms. So we will see you all at our next panel starting shortly. Thank you. Excellent. Thanks to this panel.
Thank you.
Welcome back, everybody. I am Patrick Egan. I'm professor of politics and public policy at NYU in New York, where I teach and do research on U.S. politics and, relevant to this panel, American public opinion. This is a panel on polling and media coverage of the 2022 midterms, and it comes in the wake of a lot of attention paid to election polling over the last few cycles, when there were some really big misses in election polling, particularly in 2016 and 2020, where polls were very much biased in the Democratic direction. And one of the things we'll talk about today is the extent to which polling got it right this year, and the extent to which we are comfortable with the coverage of polling in the media on elections and campaigns. So joining me are a distinguished panel coming from all different parts of the political sphere. Just to my left is Eugene Daniels. He's a White House correspondent for Politico, where he also serves as an author of its daily must-read feature, playbook. Since joining Politico in 2018, he's covered the midterms, the Democratic presidential primary, and general election through print, video journalism, and podcasts. To his left is Steve McMahon, who is co-founder and CEO of Purple Strategies, a firm that applies politically inspired solutions to corporate reputation and business challenges. He has advised senators, governors, CEOs, and presidential candidates on political and communication strategies for over 30 years. McMahon began his professional career working on the Senate and political staff of Senator Edward M. Kennedy. To his left is Bettina Inclán, who is an award-winning executive with over 20 years' experience in public and private sector communications, strategic thinking, external affairs, and crisis management. She most recently served as the Senior Communications Officer at America's Space Agency, NASA, and she has worked as Communications Director on Capitol Hill for members of Congress and Republican leadership in the U.S. House of Representatives. And last but not least, we have Jonathan Martin, who is the Politics Bureau Chief and Senior Political Columnist at Politico. Previously, he spent nearly 10 years as the National Political Correspondent for the New York Times, and he is also a longtime CNN analyst. He is the co-author of This Will Not Pass, Trump, Biden, and the Battle for America's Future, which has spent 3 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. Welcome, panel. It's great to have you all here. Welcome back, audience. And let's dig right in. I want to ask Steve your sense of when you're working with clients and when you think about your experience on political campaigns. Still a reliable barometer of what electors are going to do on election day, or is the whole thing broken?
Great question. I would say that they're still, by and large, pretty good barometers. Certainly directionally, they're very good barometers. Specifically, sometimes, you know, a poll depends upon the model of the electorate that you create. So you have to make certain assumptions about who's going to show up and what percentages, and then you weight accordingly. So if you get that weighting wrong, if for instance, you don't see or predict the number of young voters who are going to turn out, then your model is going to be weighted incorrectly and your poll will be, you know, affected by that. But I think if you look at the polling this year, in the Senate races in particular, I think they kind of went pretty much the way the bulk of the polls over the longest period of time had indicated they would. There were a few outliers. I mean, I think New Hampshire, you know, but New Hampshire kind of returned to where it was. So it looked for a minute like it was going to get close. Then it kind of returned to where it was. Grassley was another one. Ann Selzer had a poll a week out that showed it, you know, within the margin of error, and I don't think it ever was. They did sort of do a correction a couple days before the election to kind of get on the right side of it. But by and large, I think the polling was much better this time than it had been in 2020 or 2016. And I think it's because the pollsters were a lot more careful and deliberate and thoughtful in how they did their models.
Do I hit this? I'm sorry. Okay. There we go. Okay. Eugene, what do you think of that? I mean, it does look like polling was better this cycle. Tell us a little bit about what you see candidates, the extent to which candidates are using polling to improve their campaigns, and also your sense of whether the media devotes too much coverage to the horse race.
Yeah, good question. I'll start with the second part of the question, which is the media never does anything wrong. We did it all perfect. We always have. And I'll leave now. No, I think, you know, when it comes to covering polls, I think there has consistently, especially as the polling industry has had to figure out how to, one, deal with the Trump factor, deal with voters who typically have not come out to vote, and figure that out. They've done a much better job during this midterm. We have to figure out a way to focus more, in my opinion, on the issue polling, because I think that tells you a lot more than the horse race polling, right? Someone's up by 3 points and within the margin of error of 4. So that doesn't really tell you a lot about where the race is, right? That is a tied race. And then when it's in a lot of places where, you know, we put it up, it says, you know, this race isn't close, it's 4 points. And that's not always the case, and that's what we definitely have seen. I think the focus by both candidates and campaigns on polling and the media on polling has been to their detriment at some points, because that means you're not talking to the people as much, right? Because why do I need to go out and talk to all the voters and talk to people, do the shoe leather reporting that actually tells you a lot about how the electorate will feel, and so you won't be surprised, like we were in 2016, like a lot of folks were just last Tuesday, if you're talking to voters. And I think that is something that you're starting to see in newsrooms focus on a lot more. You saw a lot of newsrooms sending, at Political, we've always had this, right? We've always had kind of like our states group, people that are always in Florida, in Pennsylvania. You started to see a lot of other legacy newspapers doing the same thing, sending people to just stick in Georgia, sending people to just be in Florida. And what that tells you is that the executives and the editors at these places also understand that while polling can give you a sense of certain things, there's nothing better than being on the ground and talking to voters yourself in these places where it's going to continue to be close, because it's tried to say that, our politics is so divided right now, which means everything is going to happen at the margins. It's unlikely we're ever going to see a blue or red wave ever again because of how close these things are. And some of these states that used to be purple, like Florida, are probably going to consistently be red for a long time. And places that used to be red, like Georgia, are now probably entering in the purple space. And so there's a lot happening around the country which polling is not going to be able to pick up. People are picking up their phones less. Young voters, they would sooner jump on a grenade than have you call them and talk to you about a candidate and ask them questions about how they feel about certain things. And so I think kind of going back to using polling to show you where voters might be thinking and confirming that with your own on the ground game for the candidates and also on the ground for reporters as well.
My button is not quite pressable. Bettina, let me ask you. One of the things that seems to have happened this time around is that folks in Republican circles were kind of in the same position where Democrats were 2 years ago, where there was this sense that it was going to be an overwhelming win for their side, informed in part based upon polling, in part based upon skepticism of polling. What are you hearing from your side of the world on this? Has this really shaken people's faith in polls, or is it still going to be an important part of a campaign strategy going forward?
I think mine is also having the same problems you are. Lots of good questions there. I think one, a lot of people had PTSD on polling from what's happened. And I think some reporters are also trying to overcorrect a little bit on what had happened in the past, and they didn't want to be wrong. And they weren't sure if to trust all the polling. And I do think that there's two different kinds of polling. I think that there's the institutional polling, and then there's more the polling, the Republican-Democrat polling. And I could tell you, as a Republican operative working on campaigns, any chance I had to tell reporters, hey, my candidate's winning, look at this, because it's a cycle that you have. Like, if I have a good poll, I can get good coverage. If I get good coverage, I can get more money for fundraising, and it becomes a cycle that I am propping up, and it happens on both sides because everyone needs money to have campaigns if you have a good institutional structure. But that definitely impacted this election cycle, and you saw a lot of that. And I would say, a friend of mine, Kristen Soltis, that has polling, will say institutional polls got it right. But I think there's a lot of reporters who were nervous about polling and went into the narrative that when you have a Democrat, you have one president, the opposing party does well. And everyone fed into that and didn't look at the polling and went more with the vibe, and the vibe wasn't the right vibe.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, Democrats and Republicans were doing a lot of the same things, right? Like, when we're crafting a story, as everyone knows, we're talking to all types of people. And, when I was talking to people in the White House, senior aides to the President of the United States, what they were telling me is they were not going to have a good day on Tuesday. Some of those same people are saying something different now, like, we always saw it. And that's, that's clearly was not the case. But I talked to you 4 days before the election. And so what that tells you is, like, understanding the electorate is what I think we are missing. Is this electorate is volatile in the way that they think about things. They don't always fit in the boxes that historically they have. And so you had Democrats, Republicans, and reporters all kind of having, a lot of them having the same narrative, that the historic headwinds were going to win the day. And that is not the case because the electorate is so volatile in the way that they think about the issue sets. And there are all of these other things outside of the historic headwinds that were, as you know, the panel right before us talked about, that really won the day. Dobbs, Trump, democracy, the war in Ukraine, gas prices, all of those things led voters to feel differently than they usually have. And so the narrative and the vibe check, I think, is we ended up, a lot of folks, not me, a lot of folks, ended up focusing on, when really it's okay for us not to know. And I think we get into this issue of trying to be predictive because everyone, we're up on panels like this and everyone thinks we're the smartest people in the world, which we obviously are. But you have to allow yourself to be open to the possibility of the electorate surprising you, because at the end of the day, they are the people that are going to make the decisions, whether you try to, no matter how much influencing you're able to do beforehand.
So Jonathan, let me ask you kind of two related questions. One is it your sense, I think it's widely thought, that perhaps political reporters this year were less trustful of polls and therefore fed into this idea that we would see a red wave, in part based upon the fundamentals which would predict such a thing. And then also, so talk a little bit about that if you can, and then also, what's your sense about what the proper role is for election polling to be playing in media's coverage of campaigns?
Well, to answer your first question, there's no question about that. I think the press and everybody who works in politics knows that polling is getting harder. It's getting more expensive to get people to respond. It takes more time. And the landline challenge is self-evident. Nobody, I don't think in this room speaks on a landline very often anymore. So we all kind of get it. And I think because of that, because of some of the recent challenges with polling, I think that there was some skepticism that it would sort of undercount the Republicans. Look at Pennsylvania. Trump 2016, 2020, as everybody recalls, outperformed his polling there. What's less recalled but also significant is that Pat Toomey, when he ran in 2010 and 2016, also outran the polling in that state. And so I think there was, a view that the Republican Party voters, a lot of them have become unmoored from institutions, and because of that, their voters aren't going to participate in polls. So therefore, we have to accommodate that. And hey, by the way, Biden's only at 41, 42. Inflation's at a 40-year high. Obviously, this is going to be a Republican-leading cycle. I think Eugene mentioned an important point. I think we're past a moment in American politics where we're going to have low turnout elections. I just think that Democrats in 10 and 14 had a tough cycle in both because their voters didn't show up. That does not happen any longer because we're in the Trump era, and politics is now existential. It's good and evil. It's right and wrong. It's every 2 years a fight to the death. And I think because of that, people aren't gonna check out. And I also think that people are increasingly voting on identity and values. The maxim that our friend James Carville came up with about the economy, I think does not apply as much in a culture where people are voting more on is this side crazy, or at least is this side less crazy than the other guys, which to me has become such the sort of defining element of American politics today, which is why that all this talk about candidate equality matters, right? Because if people aren't voting on a straight parliamentary I'm happy or unhappy with the economy, then candidates are going to come into play because they're going to say, does that person reflect my values, or is that person part of a culture and politics that I reject? And I think that was certainly the case in a lot of places like New Hampshire, like Pennsylvania, like Arizona. As to the question about the role polling should play in coverage, it should, I think public opinion has to be a central role. It doesn't mean that you entirely live and die by the horse race number in surveys, but yeah, you ought to take public opinion research seriously and you're reporting, you ought to know how to use it. Look, everybody in this room knows that the horse race question is the least worthwhile part of any survey. That's not what the campaigns use the data for, and so the press shouldn't necessarily either. I think you also have to complement the use of polling with on-the-ground reporting and other kinds of sort of anecdota, if you will. You don't rely on that entirely either, but I think you have to do sort of a mix of both. I can tell you, because I was between jobs, I was checked out for a lot of the midterm, but in the final days before the election, I was in Las Vegas for an Obama rally for the ticket out there, and then I was in San Diego for Biden's rally for Mike Levin, who's in the House out in San Diego. And having covered politics for a while, I walked into both of those events, and I knew it was not going to be a sort of a flat room. I mean, yeah, Obama's a draw. Yes, the sitting president's always a draw. But I could just tell this is not 10 and 14. The crowds, the energy, just the sheer volume, people being turned away. That to me was a reveal, and it's a reminder as a reporter too. It's important to get out there. It's important to see the crowds, feel the crowds, talk to people. Shouldn't be done to the exclusion of polling, but I think pairing both to me is important.
That kind of brings me to a related question, and maybe I'll ask Eugene this question first, which is one of the things I work on at NBC News on election night is looking at exit poll results, which of course play a huge role in helping all of us decide what this election was all about. For good or for ill. And I'm wondering if you have an opinion about the extent to which we should be relying on those kinds of numbers to interpret the meaning of a recent election like the one that just happened.
I think to Jonathan's point, you do both and, right? You look at the exit polls, you see where the numbers were, because we have to have some kind of barometer in the the days right after to be able to say, these were some of the themes of the election. And what we saw was that democracy and abortion, which is what President Biden said were going to be that some of the top issues for voters, ended up being some of the top issues for voters. And so that tells you something. But then now our job, Jonathan and I, is not the rest of y'all, our job is to now go back out into the country to figure out what really happened, right? We are going to go into states and do our kind of our own autopsy of how the country voted and the way that people are thinking about things, especially because the midterms aren't over. We still have one Senate seat to continue running. And so you have to do both of those things. And the exit polls tell you a lot about the fact that young voters came out for the first time in a midterm in a real serious way. So that means that both parties, to their detriment, can or cannot pay attention to those voters, right? It tells everyone what they need to do in the next 2 years to win in 2024, and for us as reporters to do our jobs to understand and then explain what the electorate is doing and feeling. So you, at all times, have to pay attention to polling, but I think leaning on it too much, especially the horse race polling, which the exit polls aren't, right? The exit polls tell you about the issue sets. It tells you about the kinds of people that turned out. It tells you what kind of angst they have, because what is happening now, what has happened for years, is that voters are not voting because they're like excited about people anymore, right? Like during the Obama years, he won because he really thrilled people, like Democrats. He got them very excited about the process. And what you're seeing now is people are scared. When we're out talking to voters, they're scared. What you found in the exit polling is that people are scared about a lot of things. And I think that tells you that this country will continue to vote in angst of things as we move forward.
Bettina, speaking of exit polls, are there things in the numbers that have come out since Election Day around exit polls or other numbers you've seen that you think provide valuable lessons for Republicans going forward?
Yeah, I think that as someone who was in charge of Hispanic outreach for the Republican Party, one of the things that I love seeing is the increase of Hispanics and minorities in general. It wasn't the numbers that we wanted. A lot of the candidates that we wanted to win did not, but we've seen every election cycle a movement of more minorities, more Hispanics moving to the Republican Party. And I think it's a good thing because that means, me personally, I just want people to vote. I just want people to vote as much as possible. And when one group of people think that they only have one party to vote for, because then they feel disenfranchised because not everyone thinks the same way. Like in my own family, not everyone thinks the same way. So why would an entire demographic of millions of people feel that they only need to vote for one party? So I think that helps, and it has a trickle-down effect because it gets more representation of people running for office because they feel there's more opportunities for them. And then we saw a historic amount of people of different groups and different demographics running for office that makes it more representative of the American society. So that's what I loved about seeing of the exit polls, of just the diversity that we're seeing in, of course, the Republican Party, and I hope that it continues.
Steve, how about on the Democratic side? Are there numbers you're seeing out of these exit polls that surprise you, that you think are particularly illuminating for the Democratic side?
I actually think what Bettina just mentioned is something that should alarm Democrats, because the Hispanic and minority vote is moving. It's in one sense it's good because people have choices, but in another sense, if you're a Democrat, you could pretty much count on black voters to come in at 90-95%, and that's no longer the case. You could count on Hispanic voters to come in at 70% or more, and that's no longer the case. And so Democrats are now going to have to work for voters that we used to often take for granted, and that's probably a good thing. But it's also a worrying thing if your job is to elect Democrats, because it makes it it makes it a lot more complicated, and a lot more difficult to do that. And so that's probably the one thing that I saw that concerns me as a Democratic operative. But I also think Bettina raises a good point. It's probably good for the country and democracy for everybody to have to compete for votes and to make the case and win the argument.
But boy, you take Florida and Texas. You take Florida and Texas off the presidential map, and that forces Democrats to not only compete in Arizona and Georgia, but also to retain the blue wall in the Midwest. I think Florida and Texas remaining red is an enormous story, not just in presidential politics, but also in House politics, because the governors of those states and the state legend both can draw a gerrymander that locks in a sort of at least a baseline House GOP strength coming out of both delegations. And the combined delegation from those two states, I think, makes up probably like a quarter of the entire U.S. House, or something close to it, so maybe a fifth. So that's significant if those states remain Republican. And I think that's why the Hispanic realignment politically is so important, that Florida and Texas become huge assets for Republicans on the presidential level and in terms of the House.
And what everyone's talking about when it comes to voters of color is what voters of color have been saying for a long time, which is don't come knock on my door 6 weeks before the election when for 2 years you have been just thinking, I am no one to talk to. And they see, especially on the Democratic side, they see, presidents and senators and everyone, members of cabinet going to Michigan and talking to white rural voters and not knocking on their door until the last minute. And I think it is shocking for a lot of Democrats that I've talked to. It has not gone as far as Republicans have wanted, right? They've thought for a long time the numbers were going to shift quicker. And so that gives Democrats and Republicans an opportunity to continue to fight for voters who deserve to have their voices heard and who have been marginalized largely in this country since the beginning of this country. And I think having conversations with Democrats who have said, okay, now we have to invest in black voters. Well, like, yeah, they're the base of your party. So it's like, it feels like, yeah, that's very obvious, you guys. You should have been doing that this entire time. And so now I think it is kind of creating some equilibrium on the field when it comes to voters of color saying, come knock on our door, just because we say the Latino vote, but the Latino vote is, no vote is myopic or a monolith, But the Latino vote is so complicated and so interesting and fascinating if you're someone who's like obsessed with how folks vote and why they vote the way they vote. You know, Venezuelans and Cubans and Mexicans, it is rich with different types of information. And so it's an opportunity for Democrats and Republicans to zero in on the issue sets and not seeing human beings as just a box that people should fit in. It is, okay, this group of people care about this, so how do we talk to them about this? How do we make policies that make them feel better about their place in the world? And, you know, largely that's probably good for democracy.
So one thing we did learn from the exit polls this year on the point that you were just making, Eugene, is in a really unusual circumstance where you had two black Americans opposing one another in a Senate race. This is, of course, the Warnock-Walker race in Georgia. I'm just looking at the exit poll data here. 90% of black voters supported the Democrat. So one could argue that, you know, that's kind of a hard test of blacks' loyalty to the Democratic Party when they are given the choice of a Republican candidate that many people said had some obvious flaws, some obvious weaknesses. But, you know, that seems like a number that's important and helpful to know that we wouldn't know necessarily unless we had polling and exit polling.
I spent some time in Georgia at Senator Warnock's church. They call him Reverend there. Do not call him Senator, they will shut you down. And, you know, I talked to someone who's deep blue, has never voted for Republican. He was excited by the idea that there were going to be two black men running against each other, saying that this shows you that the country is moving in a different direction. But then when I talked to voters about, okay, so that is interesting to you. These are, you know, you've taken out the race issue when it comes to these two voters. They're both black men. But what I heard from a lot of Democratic voters and a lot of black voters in general was that they felt like Walker was embarrassing for black people. Their words, not mine. And I think that was something that changed. That is why you see in that polling 90% of black voters going to Warnock, because, you know, there's no built-in difference making than like the guy who is standing in the pulpit of Martin Luther King Jr. and you know, Herschel Walker and all of the issues that he brought with him that Republicans weren't excited about themselves. And so I think I don't know if Georgia is and that number is interesting in Georgia. I don't know how you're able to overlay that around the rest of the country. I think, again, is what it tells people is keep paying attention to the black vote, keep paying attention to the Latino vote, because those numbers at any point can change, one, depending on candidate quality, right? Which, you know, thanks to Mitch McConnell, we've been saying a lot over the last few weeks, but also because of the issue sets. And I think that is largely what I take from the exit polling in that number.
Steve, I see you have 538 open on your little iPad mini there, and I wanted to ask you and anyone else on the panel, I mean, you know, a lot of our attention that's been focused on polling, really, I think we do owe that, for better or for worse, to Nate Silver and his website, which kind of became first most prominent in the 2012 election, where there was a sense that he had sort of this magic sauce that would be able to predict all the states, et cetera. Do you think that's been a good or a bad or neutral development for American democracy, Steve, that we've got this ability to aggregate and instantly know what the polling is telling us?
I think on the whole it's been good, because when you have the opportunity to kind of look at a body of work as opposed to a single poll, it really helps. And when you think about the value of aggregating a bunch of polls and the fact that the margin of error goes so low when you do that, I think it's helpful as a political scientist, as an operative. I'm just looking at Nate's Senate forecast, where he says it's 59% likely that the Republicans win the Senate and 41% likely that the Democrats do, and this was the final forecast. So it's not infallible, but it's a lot better than what we had before. And you know, one of the things I noticed toward the end, there were a lot of the kinds of polls that Bettina was talking about, where they were candidate polls that were kind of creeping into some of these aggregators, which I think favored Republicans, because there were more Republican operatives and campaigns that were pushing it, which helped to feed the narrative. I think it would be better if the aggregators were a little bit more discriminating about polling that is actually accurate and historically, has been historically accurate over time. Institutional polling weighing more than partisan polling. There's not, I think, enough of that discrimination that probably would benefit Nate and everybody else. But on the whole, I think it's been very helpful.
If we can just point a finger at the voters too, which I always enjoy doing. Look, there's a demand side issue here. If people didn't want to click on polling data and horse race updates and try to game out control of Congress and do forecasting, then those websites wouldn't exist. The Times wouldn't shell out hundreds of thousands of dollars to do extensive polling in the months leading up to the election. There's an audience for it. I mean, that's what we need to really address is people like this. It's like I used to have this line about the great thing about the internet is that readers would always tell us that they wanted to hear more about the issues. And I said, you know what? I was just checking our traffic recently, and that story about Medicaid reform, it was pretty far down on the list. And I couldn't help but notice that the royal family and their drama was pretty damn high on the list. So don't lie to me about what you want. We know what you're clicking on, people. And I think the same applies to polling. I think there's a sort of, the dogs like the dog food, so we give it to them kind of thing.
And it's also not just the polling that is the issue, right? You said 41%. The way that Nate Silver does that polling is 41 in 100 times Democrats will win the Senate. If someone told you, if you play the lottery 100 times, you may win the lottery 41 of those times, you would probably play the lottery a lot, right? Yeah. And so it's the reading of polls that often leads us into these issues and giving us these vibe narratives throughout the months and months before the election. Because it's not that, okay, there's no chance that this is going to happen. Donald Trump, right, in 2016, in that exact same kind of aggregation of polls, he had like a 30 to 40% chance of winning, and we know what happened there. We didn't learn all the lessons that we should have, which is that doesn't mean that something isn't possible. It means that it's less likely.
Let's talk a little bit about the coverage of the campaign that just ended. Bettina, from your perspective, what did the media get right and what did they get wrong in terms of, not predicting the outcome, but in terms of covering the issues that mattered to voters? Where did you see the hits and misses this time around?
Well, what we know is people care about the economy. Abortion was a big issue. At the end of the day, the world, our country, is very divided, and there's a lot of issues that the kitchen table issues were incredibly important. Most people cover that, and I think it's just in the panel before, some of it got away from us because as we talk here, for the reporters, it was the vibe. There was an interesting article, the New York Times, they did a piece on the House races, and they looked at 4 House races, and they talked about it, but in the article itself, while they said that the Republicans were going to win, the poll itself did not say that Republicans were going to win.
A now infamous story.
So I think humans aren't perfect, polls aren't perfect, and all of these polls are just trying to predict the future. And sometimes we get it right, sometimes we get it wrong. And I think to Jonathan's point, a lot of people like polls because politics is complicated, politics is hard, and you give them something that is easy to understand.
Yeah.
And
who's up, who's down, what's going to happen,
So that is easy for voters. Like I spend, as a person that does communications, my entire job is to try to make the difficult simple to people, and that is simple. I think also those of us that are operatives up here also understand we don't want our candidate to be defined if they're up to or down to, because elections have changed. People are voting weeks, sometimes months before the actual date. So that's not an accurate depiction. And I think that the reporting has to reflect that, but even voters don't completely understand that themselves. So there's a lot of learning that has to get to us being more accurate, but it's complicated.
The day that we all stop using polls will be the day that the question that every one of us gets stops being asked, which is what's going to happen. I mean, you can basically boil down elections to what's going to happen. Voters want to know it. Readers want to know it. That's what the question they ask. It all comes down to what's going to happen. Who's going to control Congress? Is Trump going to run again? Is Biden going to run again? What's going to happen? And I'm sorry, but that's what humans are interested in, is what's going to happen. And yes, they're also interested in policy issues. Of course, that's the meat and potatoes of governance. But they're also curious human beings, and they want to know what's going to happen.
One thing that we've seen, I think, a fair amount of confirmation of polling data from election data is the issue of abortion, where obviously the Dobbs decision unleashed a whole bunch of debates and controversy around that issue. And what I think we discovered was that certainly confirmation of the fact that most Americans are not comfortable with a complete ban on abortion, although that's basically the case in about, I don't know, 12 or 15 states right now. But even in a place like Kentucky, refused to enact what would have essentially been an abortion ban in the state constitution. Is that issue going to stick around with us for a while? My sense is yes. Steve, is that, do you think the issue is going to stick around, and do you think it helps Democrats? That's sort of the conventional wisdom these days.
Yes and yes. Democrats have been saying for a long time that they're going to come and take away your right to choose. And one of the challenges with that argument has always been that people didn't fundamentally believe it was possible. And I think what happened with Dobbs is they now see the wolf at the door. And so, one of the reasons I think turnout was so high among young people, and young women in particular, is because of Dobbs. And until that issue is settled, and it's not going to be settled, I don't think, anytime soon, it's going to be an issue that is very, very important to voters. It's going to be an issue that favors Democrats enormously. And it's one where I think, Republicans have to kind of figure out what their position is going to be, because having 100 different positions is not going to be a viable option, I don't think, over time. So if you're a Democrat, you're going to be running on abortion, I think, for quite a long time.
And also, we're going to get these mics together, I swear to God. And also what you ended up seeing, and it came from the top, the days after Dobbs came through and Roe v. Wade fell, what you heard from Democrats at the top, President Biden, Vice President Harris, was that it wasn't just abortion, right? And so what they did, and what Democrats have done a good job of, and this is why it's going to be a lasting issue, is that it's not just that they took away abortion, is that in the concurring opinion from the Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, he brought up same-sex marriage, he brought up contraception, he brought up the right to do what you want to do in your own bedroom. And now the other, conservative justices did not get on board with that, right? He was on his own. But what that gave Democrats was fodder to say, see, we told you, it is not just about abortion. It is about all of these other rights and your right to privacy, which was the argument for Democrats and will continue to be their argument in that sphere. And what that does is it creates coalitions. So it's not just, young women who care about abortion. Now you're talking to queer people who want to get married. You're talking to single women, whether they are Republican or Democrat, who want to have the right to contraception and things like Plan B. And so this is why it's a lasting issue, not just because, folks are worried about the access to abortion, is because they're worried about their fundamental rights. And what's going to be fascinating is if Democrats are going to be able to convince the American people that now they are the party of freedom, right? We for most of my entire life, and probably all of yours up here, is that Republicans were the party that cared about freedom and you being able to do what you want to do. And now Democrats have a chance to flip that on its head if they do it right.
So let me just push back on that. I mean, I generally share that view, which is that this is an issue that advantages Democrats. But let's think about some governors that are leading states with essentially near total bans on abortion who didn't seem to suffer at all for this issue. Greg Abbott, Mike DeWine. These are folks who you could argue that the issue didn't stick, even though when you look at polling in those states, you've got a strong majority against the near complete ban that you've got in those states. What's going on there?
Well, I mean, to be clear, in the states where it's going to be in the margins, in those states that are kind of purplish, this is where it's going to be an issue. In those deep red states, the folks largely in that state have decided their own way on abortion. But you look at Governor Tony Evers winning for the second time. You look at Whitmer being able to do that. Both of them put abortion access at the center of their campaigns in states that, are rickety for Democrats at times. And so it's going to be in those states that are purple. It's going to be in those states that are trending one way or another where it's going to matter. And those states that are deep blue, that are deep red, it's unlikely to have a lot of the issue. Because when you look at polling and dig down deep in some of those states where there weren't bans or there were going to be bans, you saw differences, right? You saw that folks in states where there are a lot of Democrats were more worried about abortion access because there were laws on the books, there were those trigger laws. And in states that were red and you have a lot more Republicans, they were fine with that because that is an issue that they care deeply about and they care, and they always have, and that's not going to change. But it's in those states that are trending blue or red, or trending either way, and more importantly, purple states and state purple states where it's actually going to matter.
Nominated a woman in Florida to run against Ron DeSantis. Say, I don't know, the former member of Congress whose father was a governor and senator from the state who could have, oh, that's right, she didn't get the nomination in 2018, Ron DeSantis won. No, but if somebody like Gwen Graham had been the nominee instead of like Charlie Crist, who makes the term retread look a little bit too gentle, then I think it would have been fascinating. Would she have won against somebody like DeSantis? No. But man, I think that margin would have been a lot closer in Florida. I think Florida's basically a red state now. But it would have been interesting if Democrats had at least tried to put DeSantis to some kind of a test, right? To put him through his paces before 24, to make him answer in specifics about abortion, which he has really sort of dodged. And I think if you had a formidable candidate like a Graham who could have potentially done that, it would have made that race a heck of a lot more interesting.
I think we're ready to take some questions from the peanut gallery.
As we're waiting for that, Henry Cuellar, who's the only anti-abortion Democrat, also won, right? And so you are also seeing how partisanship kind of zeroes out a lot of this at times. So I think the answer is all of this stuff, to take from what Bettina said, is very complicated, and there's never going to be an easy answer. And sometimes when answering the question that J-Mart is correct about is what's going to happen, it's okay for us to say we don't know, but here's the information and evidence we have at this point. We don't have to, our jobs as reporters, and I would say also our jobs as your jobs as political strategists and campaign operatives, is not to be predictive, but to say this is what we have, this is the picture of what we have, which polling really is not a magical ball. It is right at this point, this is how voters are feeling. Or this is how they felt a week and a half ago when we asked them. And things could have changed from there.
I would love to hear you all talk a little bit more about the women's vote in this election. And I'm also just curious, I don't believe there have been enough connections made to doing away with abortion in total, potentially birth control, that actually it could very quickly turn into more of an economic issue. And I know on the progressive side that's not how we normally talk about it, but I would love comments on both of those things, just your general thoughts on the women's turnout in this election and then on abortion as an economic issue.
Well, I mean, the women's turnout in this election, particularly young women, was, as you pointed out earlier, Jody, pretty extraordinary. And I think it exceeded what people were sort of planning and counting on. And it's obvious that I think what I saw in the exit polls was that cohort went for Democrats by over 20 points, and in Pennsylvania and in other places it was closer to 30. So, I mean, if you think about that, and what was motivating that. I mean, there are probably a lot of things, but certainly the thing that was front and center and part of every conversation was choice and Dobbs. And I think Eugene's right about where the argument ultimately goes, because it's not just about abortion, it's about coming after your freedoms. And do you get to live the life you want to live the way you want to live it? Or a bunch of white guys going to tell you how you should do everything? And I think that is a really good battleground for Democrats over time. And I don't think it's going to go away. And you know, you're right, Pat, that in the red states it didn't hurt a couple of the red governors. But I kind of view this as more of a federal issue than a state issue, even though the action's happening at the state level to ban it. The protection ultimately is going to come from the federal level. And so I think Democrats are going to keep putting a bill on the floor to codify Roe v. Wade year after year after year, and they're going to keep making Republicans vote on it. And then a lot of these other freedoms that we want to protect are going to get similar kinds of votes. And at some point, the Republican Party is going to have to figure out where they want to be. And if you look at the demographics of young people and where they are on these issues, I mean, there are a lot of Republicans who are young who don't think anybody should tell them who they can marry, don't think anybody should tell them what they can do with their body. They may want lower taxes and less government, but they certainly don't want more government in their lives, their personal lives. And I think this is something that as the voters are replaced over time, and I don't mean voter replacement like Tucker Carlson. I mean as older generations die and are replaced by younger generations, those younger generations on these issues in particular are very progressive. And I think that's a real challenge for the Republican Party, and it's a real opportunity for Democrats.
And on that, and on abortion being an economic issue, you know, when I was talking to folks right after Dobbs, there's a cohort within the Democratic Party that sees it as an economic issue. Vice President Harris actually talked about this a lot for the administration. And something that I heard from folks was anything can be a kitchen table issue, right? Like the access to abortion and when you can start a family and not start a family is an economic issue. Immigration is an economic issue. And so, you know, as campaigns move forward, thinking about the issue that might have, you know, years ago seemed fringe, right? The ability to get married is an economic issue. Trust me, I just did it, you know, things change. And so I think the idea that there are these different categories of things and issues that voters can't put on their kitchen table and worry about how that's going to affect their bottom line. Culture is a part of how you see yourself in this country, which means it's a part of your economic outlook in this country. And I think that is something that Democrats, despite how much they talk about it, sometimes often miss that. And I think what you're seeing on the abortion issue is them waking up to the idea that the culture war, it can and also can be an economic issue. The same thing on LGBTQ plus rights issues. You talked about the attacks on trans kids. And when you talk to voters, whether or not their child is going to be there tomorrow is an economic issue for them also, right? And so it is not just as simple as saying these things are cultural war issues, this is a kitchen table issue. If Democrats and Republicans do their jobs, which is to convince people that certain things are going to affect their bottom line and their pocketbooks, then everything can be an economic issue.
I just checked the Wisconsin exit polling on the governor's race. Probably, in the eyes of a lot of people in this country working politics, certainly Democrats, the most important governor's race given the implications for 2024, and also probably the most hotly contested in a really 50-50 state. So when you think about that, Wisconsin, basically a break-even state. Tony Evers won the women's vote by 13 points. I mean, you just can't have a competitive election in any state that close when one party is taking a margin of 13% among women. It's extraordinary. So I think that gets to your point, Jody. I checked Arizona too. It was closer, but Hobbs won women by 9 points in Arizona, a state that's also sort of on a knife's edge. Again, the Republican Party is not going to be competitive in statewide elections in places that are that divided when they're losing women by 9 points in the case of Arizona and 13 points in the case of Wisconsin. So yeah, hugely, hugely important.
probably good to note how much of that is depends on race and ethnicity. So I'm looking at my exit poll results, as we all do, and Republicans won white women this year, and they did real well among white women without a college degree. It almost went 2-to-1 for Republicans this year. Bettina, do you have an instinct about how your side should be navigating? Oh, thanks. Have an instinct about how your side should be navigating this issue going forward?
In many ways, I think.
Sorry.
Eventually, we will all get this right. I always have an issue when we say women vote or Hispanic vote or black vote, because it's not one vote. Like, I joke around, my constant joke is my mom is Cuban, my dad's Mexican, the only thing they have in common is me. With women as well, it's like young women voted one way and married women tend to vote another way. So to your question about, yes, the Republican Party should do more. I also don't think that we're losing all women. I think that women are very diverse, and there's women that are pro-choice, and there's women that are, pro-life, and it's, I don't want to say complicated again, but like it's not a monolithic vote. I do think that in general, the Republican Party needs to do more of putting an agenda out, and I think one of the issues that we had in this election is we were very good at saying why the Democrats sucked, or why Joe Biden was bad for the economy or bad for the country, but we didn't provide enough of an agenda of what was the future. And my old boss, Rick Scott, I know that's something he really wanted to do. He wanted to put on an agenda of like, what are Republicans for? I myself, I'm probably a little bit more progressive on this as a mother of 2 small children. I think we should put an agenda more that is more pro-family, that does more for families with children. And that's what I would love to see in the future, that if we're how to support people who want to have families, but in these economic times, make it really, really difficult.
So could each of you share with us what election outcome was the most surprising to you, either by who won or by how much the margin was?
I think for me it was less which actual election and more the amount of young voters that turned out, and more importantly how much they turned out for Democrats, right? The 18 to 29-year-old, which is apparently the only people that are young in this country, that vote went for Democrats more than 50%, and they were the only age group in which that was the case, right? And so it tells you so much more about how the Republicans and Democrats are going to have to change the way they think about young voters, because the conventional wisdom was that, young voters talk a lot on Twitter, they are very upset in protests, but they don't come out to vote. They have proven in both 2020 and 2022 to be a very important piece of the electorate, and that is going to shape the future of both parties and this country for a very long time. I think the margin by which Ron DeSantis won, even though I think all of us have decided that Florida is a red state, or Florida has decided that Florida is a red state, and we just have let them. I think that was surprising, and I think a lot of operatives found that surprising. And so, as that came down, and you talked to a lot of Republican operatives, what they said was, this is him showing out for 2024 in a way that they didn't anticipate. Had it been just 10 points, I think that you think differently, but when you're at 19 or 20 points, whatever the margin actually ends up being once everything's said and done, that has really shaken Republicans in the Republican shadow primary moving forward.
I would say, for me personally, it was the Arizona governor's race. Kari Lake was sort of the second coming of Donald Trump, the most talented candidate ever, had everything going for her. And I think most people had sort of declared her the winner before the election occurred. And it now looks like she's going to lose, which makes me very, very happy.
As a Miami native from Florida, I'm going to say DeSantis more, not surprised but excited. Miami-Dade County going Republican was amazing, because I can remember being on the McCain campaign, and my only job is I was in charge of all of South Florida, was to keep the margin so we could like try to win the state, and to see it completely win for Miami-Dade County, that was great. And seeing the numbers of how he did in other parts of the state with Puerto Rican voters, South American voters, I think went for him by over 18 points. Like, it's a very large coalition, and I think David Plouffe that said like the Obama coalition in Florida is lost or something like that. So that's a huge thing. And to your point earlier, when you're looking at presidential politics, that's huge. That's huge. So that was a happy thing for me. And in general, it's one of the things that we've said a little bit on this. It's a long-term ground game. You mentioned something earlier. Don't come for my vote and then disappear for 2 years. I was part of the RNC when we did that autopsy. I did it right before my wedding. It was very stressful. And a big thing was, we can't do that anymore. We can't just like show up and then ask you for your vote and say it's going to change this time, and then disappear for 2 years. So you have, community centers that have popped up in different parts of the country to engage these non-traditional Republican voters, not only in Florida, but in Colorado and Nevada, and afterwards I can tell you lots of stories about those. But it changes, and I think that while there's a lot of ground to be done, it's exciting to see progress. And to my point when I first started, that is good for the country to get more people involved.
One of the recurring debates in this country about politics is the persuasion versus mobilization question. Goodness, if this election does not prove the salience of the persuasion side of that argument, I don't know what ever will. I mean, you had really unfavorable terrain for Democrats structurally, and they still were able to win, I think in part on persuasion. And what makes me say that especially is the margins in some of these states. Look, Gretchen Whitmer is not winning Michigan by double digits on mobilization, right? She's persuading a lot of voters there who were Trump supporters, and who typically have been trending Republican to vote for her as a Democratic governor. Similarly, I think you look at somebody in Colorado like Jared Polis. I mean, he's not winning in the state in some of the more rural counties in that state like he did by mobilization. I think it's really clear that there's still, even in era polarization, there's still significant numbers of voters, at least in down ballot races, who will vote for one side or the other. And God, I forgot Maine. Who could forget Maine? I mean, Janet Mills beats Paul LePage by 13 points, I think. Paul LePage was a two-term governor. Yes, he had won with 3 candidates in the race both times, but still, that margin is extraordinary, and it tells me that there's more voters up for grabs, at least down ballot, than sort of conventional wisdom has suggested in this era of polarization.
And I think another thing that surprised me was not like an actual race was the concessions that they happened, and there, I think all of us in here and every Democrat and Republican I talked to over the last couple of years was terrified about what was going to happen post-election day, not just with actual voters and being upset and taking up arms and all of that stuff, but whether or not Republicans would say, I lost this election, carry on, whether or not that was going to happen. And we saw that. Even Dan Bullock in New Hampshire, who's extremely Trumpian and kind of led us to believe that he wasn't going to accept the election election results if he was going to lose. He also did the same thing. And so, Joe Biden would say, like, democracy won. But I think that what voters were telling everyone is that, one, by the people that threatened to not agree with the election results, so the 2020 results, they didn't like that. They didn't want chaos, right? I don't know that voters stood up and said, we are going to preserve democracy. I don't know that was what happened. I could be wrong. But what it ended up happening is that they did do that. And they said, if you don't defend democracy, if you aren't someone who's going to lead us to believe that you are going to accept the results as we give them to you, then you can't be in an office. And then as those folks came down and they lost, they did call their opponents and thank them for a hard race. They have not been out there spreading lies or even hinting at things that could have been shady in the election. And that is good for this country. I think, everyone can, hopefully, probably not, but everyone should agree on that the bar's on the floor, right? Like that is it's like as low as you can possibly get, people, moving on afterwards. But that means that the chaos after the 2020 election could have shaken voters so much that they were just so uncomfortable with it, largely, that everyone's kind of going to move on. Carrie Lake is obviously the outlier on that and has already began spreading lies about them, Arizona slow walking the results because they knew she was going to win and all this other stuff. But largely, by and large, Republicans also just accepted the results of the election, and that's a good thing. And that's I think that I was surprised by. I think the administration was surprised by it because a lot of folks that work in the administration on this issue within DHS were on their toes to see how this was gonna shake out.
And I'll just close with what I thought were the most surprising things, which was the flip in state legislative control in Michigan. I'm just looking it up, Michigan and Minnesota, which is now, they're both Democratic trifectas. And the Democrats won the state house in Pennsylvania, splitting control there. I don't think anyone saw that stuff coming, and that has big implications for policies in those states. Do we have another question?
Just one quick one. Just curious, I think we've all talked about it, both panels, with regards to the increase in women voters, which is great. But no one really talked about the fact that, and I don't have facts or numbers to back this up, but I know just from reading, more women also ran. I think Republicans and Democrats did a much, much better job in recruiting candidates, particularly women candidates, particularly women of color. And whether they won or lost, they were out there, they were competitive, they were raising money, which was all good. And I'm wondering, from what you've seen and heard with regards to, is this a positive trend, and hopefully something that after 50 years or 150 years, we will be on the uptick here versus we pick up, 10 more women and we lose, 29 the next cycle. So just kind of curious as to your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Dios mío, santísimo. I was at the NRCC when we started an effort called Project Grow, and Elise Stefanik, we asked her to head it up, and it was an effort.
What happened to her, Elise Stefanik?
So anyway, and it was an effort to get more Republican women in office, and I helped with it. It was and it's great to see how it has expanded. So instead of one person doing it, there's lots of people who had invested in it. We saw a record number of women, especially Latina women, running for office, a lot more women in general. And I think it's on both sides. And that is, my point again, I clearly have maybe a little bit different take on the democracy thing. And I'll say, I know I'll talk about it, but well, you brought it up. But we have a great democracy. We have lots of people that, is it perfect? No, but it's getting better every day in that you have more representation, and sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. But I guess from my perspective, where my family comes from, I'll take this democracy over where they came from 1,000,000 days and twice on Sunday. So it's to your point, yes, there's a lot more women. I think it's only going to get better as we also create better forms of recruiting them, better support system, but fundraising. There was a huge issue in the past on making sure that they had the right the funding sources. So, yay.
I think what both parties have realized is that you have to have a bench that looks like America, right? That things have changed. Democrats got there earlier, obviously, but Republicans have gotten there, and you look at the amount of women candidates, but you also look at the amount of LGBTQ plus candidates, right? You have a lesbian governor in Oregon, Kotek, 2. There we go. Thank you very much. Massachusetts as well, and so what that tells the young people, and I think this is one of the reasons why they're getting more excited, is like, oh, this isn't just for old white guys, right? This is a process that includes women that look like me, women that love like me, people who come from a similar background as my family members. And I think that is largely good, as you're saying. It's like really good for democracy, for people to look around and see their leadership look like them. That also changes when, if you cover Congress or half cover Congress and pay attention, like the conversations that the women have are so different when the men are not there. Like the men bring all this chaos a lot of the times, and the women are don't they, just in general? I mean, go ahead. But like if the women, when they come together, they put aside their differences on policy, and they are much more likely to compromise and come together and figure out what's best for the American people. And I think the more of that you have going on at these tables is really important up and down the ballot.
And I'll just add, I just looked up, I think the neatest figure to this point is that a record 5 states had women running against each other for governor this year. Both the 2 major party candidates were women. That's a pretty good development. Well, maybe on that happy note, we will we will close. Am I closing the day, or is somebody closing the day?
Oh, I'm the official closer.
You're the closer. All right. Well.
Just that housekeeping. Terrific job, panel. Terrific job. And this morning as well with Betsy Fisher Martin. So we break now for the day in terms of work, except your work is never done because we talk incessantly with each other. But anyway, so this session ends. We can either walk or take, are we all walking or? I think walking or bus or just walking? Walking or cabbing, the buses went away. Back down to the hotel. And then your presence is not required until 6 o'clock for cocktails and a reception in the hotel up on the 7th floor, that Tudor Hall restaurant. And we stay put. We segue from that to dinner. So I think that's it. And then tomorrow is really a repeat of the program in terms of timing as well. The 2 panels, and we start at noon-ish. Okay. So that sound good? Terrific. Okay. Great. Yay. We did it. Let me just say, though, before we convene, too, just a couple of thank yous along the way, because you don't want to wait till the very end, because maybe they'll screw up in between and don't deserve the thank yous. Only kidding. But I did want to thank Steve McMahon, man of many parts, who knows everyone. I consider him my curator-in-chief for all of these panels. So thank you, Steve. And this was not an easy one, with some changes that had to be made at the last minute. I did also want to acknowledge that you know them in different capacities, but 2 members of the Advisory Council of the Brademas Center are part of today's proceedings, Ellen Toscano and Jennifer Poulikides. So they're actually my board of trustees. And then, as usual, great thanks to Tom McIntyre and Steve Hoyer for getting us organized. And on to tomorrow. Thank you.